Chapter 26 of the Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 26. The Battle. The chain which fastened Black Bart had been passed around the trunk of a tree that stood behind the ranch house, and there the great dog lay, tethered. Dr. Byron had told Whistling Dan, with some degree of horror, that the open air was in the highest degree dangerous to wounds, but Whistling Dan had returned no answer. So Black Bart lay all day in the soft stand, easing himself from time to time into a new position, and his thoughtful eyes seemed to be concentrated on the desire to grow well. Beside him was the chair in which Dan Barry sat for many an hour of the day and even the night. Kate Cumberland watched the animal from the shadow of the house. His eyes were closed, and the long, powerful head lay inert on the sand, yet she knew that the wolf dog was perfectly aware of her presence. Day after day since he lay there, she had attempted to approach Black Bart, and day after day he had allowed her to come within reaching distance of him, only to drive her back at the last moment by a sudden display of the murderous long fangs, or by one of those snarls which came out of the black depths of its heart. Now a dog snarls from not far down in its throat, but the noise of an angered wild beast rolls up out of its very entrails, a passion of hate and defiance. And when she heard that sound, or when she saw the still more terrible silent rage of the beast, Kate Cumberland's spirit failed, and she would shrink back again to a safe distance. She was not easily discouraged. She had that grim resolution which comes to the gambler after he has played at the same table night after night, night after night, and lost, until, playing with the last of his money, he begins to mutter through his set teeth, "The luck must change." So it was with Kate Cumberland, for in Black Bart she saw the only possible clue to Whistling Dan. There was the stallion, to be sure, but she knew Satan too well. Nothing in the wide world could induce that wild heart to accept more than one master, more than one friend. For Satan there was in the animal world Black Bart, and in the world of men Dan Barry. These were enough. For all the rest he kept the disdainful speed of his slender legs or the terror of his teeth and trampling hoofs. Even if she could have induced the stallion to eat from her hand, she could never have made him willing to trust himself to her guidance. Some such thing she felt she must accomplish with Black Bart. To the wild beast with the scarred and shaggy head, she must become a necessary, an accepted thing. One repulse did not dishearten her. Again and again she made the trial. She remembered having read that no animal can resist the thoughtful patience of thinking man, and hour after hour she was there until a new light in the eye of the wolf dog warned her that the true master was coming. Then she fled, and from a post of vantage in the house she would watch the two. An intimacy surpassing the friendships and devotions of human beings existed between them. She had seen the wolf lie with its great head on the foot of his master, and the unchanging eyes fixed on Barry's face, and so for an hour at a stretch in mute worship. Or she had watched the master go to the great beast to change the dressing, a thing which could not be done too often during the day. She had seen the swift hands remove the bandages, and she had seen the cleansing solution applied. She knew what it was. It stung even the unscratched skin, and to a wound it must be torture. But the wolf lay and endured, not even shuddering at the pain. It had seemed to her that this was the great test. If she could make the wolf lie like this for her, then, truly, she might feel herself in some measure admitted to that mystic fellowship of the three, the man, the stallion, and the wolf. If she could, with her own unaided hands, remove the bandages and apply that solution. Then she could know many things, and she could feel that she was nearer to Whistling Dan than ever before. So she had come time and again with the basin and the roll of cloth in her arm, and she had approached with infinite patience, step by step, and then inch by inch. Once it had taken a whole hour for her to come within a yard of the beast, and all that time Black Bart had lain with closed eyes. But at that critical instant always, there was that silent writhing up of the lips, and the gleam of hate, or the terrible snarl while the eyes fastened on her throat. Her heart had stopped in mid-beat, and that day she ran back into the house and threw herself on her bed, and would not come from her room till the following morning. Now, as she watched from the shadow of the house, with the basin of antiseptic under her arm, the gambler's desperation rose stronger and stronger. She came out at length, and walked steadily towards Black Bart. She had grown almost heedless of fear at this moment, but when she was within a pace, once more the head reared back, the teeth flashed, and the heart of Kate Cumberland, as always, stopped. Yet she did not retreat this time. All the color left her face, so that her eyes seemed amazingly blue and wide. One foot drew back, trembling, ready to spring to safety, yet she held her place. She moved, and it was towards Black Bart. At that came a snarl that would have made the heart of a lone grizzly quake and leave his new-found nuts. One further pace she made, and the beast plunged up and braced itself with its one strong foreleg. A devil of yellow-green gleamed in either eye, and past the grinning fangs she saw the hot red throat, and she saw the flattened ears, the scars on the bony forehead, the muscles that bulged on the base of the jaw. Aye, strength to drive those knife-like teeth through flesh and bone at a single snap. More, she had seen their effect, and the throat of a bull-calf cut at a single slash. And yet she sank on her knees beside the monster. His head was well nigh as high as hers. Then, if he attacked, there could be no dream of escape for her, or she might drag herself away from the tearing teeth, a disfigured horror forever. Think not that an iota of all these terrors missed her mind. No, she felt the fangs buried in her throat, and heard the snarl of the beast stifled with blood. Yet she laid her hand on the bandage across the shoulder of Black Bart. His head whirled, with those ears flattened, and with that long, lean neck. It was like the head of a striking snake. Her sleeve was rolled up to the elbow, and over the bare skin the teeth of the wolf-dog were set. The snarl had grown so deep and hideous that the terror of it fairly shook her, and she saw that the jaws of the beast slavered with hunger. She knew 1,000 things about Black Bart, and among the rest that he had tasted human blood, and there is a legend which says that once a wild beast has tasted the blood of man, he will taste it a second time before he dies. She thought of that. She dared not turn her head, lest she should encounter the hellfire of Bart's eyes. Yet she had passed all ordinary fear. She had reached the exquisite frenzy of terror when it becomes one with courage. The very arm over which the wolf's teeth were set moved, raised, and with both hands she untied the knot of the bandage. The snarling rose to a pitch of maniacal rage. The teeth compressed. If they broke the skin, it was the end. The first taste of blood would be enough, and drew away her arm. If she had started then, all the devil in the creature would be loosed, for her terror taught her that, and by some mysterious power that entered her at that moment, she was able to turn her head slowly and look deep into those terrible eyes. Her arm was released, but Black Bart crouched, and the snake-like head lowered. He was quivering throughout that steel-muscled body to throw himself at her throat. The finger was on the hair trigger. It needed a pressure not greater than a bodiless thought, and still she looked into the eyes of the wolf dog, and her terror had made her strangely light of body and dizzy of mind. Then the change came suddenly. The yellow-green changed, swirled in the eyes of Black Bart. The eyes themselves wavered, and at last looked away. The snarl dropped to a sullen growl, and Black Bart lay down as he had been before. His head was still turned toward her, to be sure, and the teeth were still bared, as with rapid, deft fingers she undid the bandage, and from instant to instant, as the bandage, in spite of her care, pressed against the wound, the beast shivered, and wicked glances flashed up at her face. The safe-blower who finds his soup cooling and dares not set it down felt as Kate Cumberland felt then. She never knew what kept her hands steady, but steady they were. The cloth was removed, and now she could see the red, angry wound, with the hair shaven away to a little distance on every side. She dipped her cloth into the antiseptic. It stung her fingers. She touched the cloth lightly against the wound, and to her astonishment the wolf dog relaxed every muscle, and let his head fall to the ground. Also the growl died into a soft whine, and this in turn ended. She had conquered. Aye, when the wound was thoroughly cleansed, and when she started to wind the bandage again, she had even the courage to touch Black Bart's body and make him rise up so that she could pass the cloth freely. At her touch he shuddered, to be sure, as a man might shudder at the touch of an unclean thing, but there was no snarl, and the teeth were not bared. As she tied the knot which secured the bandage in its place, she was aware that the eyes of Bart, no longer yellow-green, watched her, and she felt some vague movement of the wonder that was passing through the brute mind. Then the head of the wolf dog jerked up. He was staring at something in the distance, and there was nothing under heaven that Bart would raise his head to look at in this manner, except one thing. The fingers of Kate grew stiff and trembled. Slowly, in a panic, she finished the knot, and then she was aware of someone who had approached without a sound and now stood behind her. She looked up, at length, before she rose to her feet. Thankfulness welled up warm in her heart to find her voice steady and commonplace when she said, "The wound is much better. Bart will be well in a very few days now." Whistling Dan did not answer, and his wondering eyes glanced past her own. She saw that he was staring at a double row of white indentations on her forearm, where the teeth of Black Bart had set. He knew those marks, and she knew he knew. Strength was leaving her, and weakness went through her, water where blood should have been. She dared not stay. In another moment she would be hopelessly in the grip of hysteria. So she rose and passed Dan without a word, and went slowly towards the house. She tried to hurry, indeed, but her legs would not quicken their pace. Yet at length she had reached shelter, and no sooner was she past the door of the house than her knees buckled. She had to steady herself with both hands as she dragged herself up the stairs to her room. There, from the window, she looked down and saw Whistling Dan standing as she had left him, staring blankly at the wolf dog. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 27. The Conquest. There was no star-storming confidence in Kate Cumberland after that first victory. Rather, she felt as the general who deploys his skirmishers and drives in the outposts of an enemy. The advantage is his, but it has really only served to give him some intimation of the strength of the enemy. At the supper table this night she found Whistling Dan watching her, not openly, for she could never catch his eye, but subtly, secretly, she knew that he was measuring her, studying her, whether in hostility, amity, or mere wonder, she could not tell. Finally, a vast uneasiness overtook her, and she turned to the doctor for relief. Dr. Randall Byron held a singular position in the intention of Kate. Since the night of the fire and her open talk with him, the doctor knew everything, and women are troubled in the presence of a man who knows the details of the past. The shield behind which they hide in social intercourse is a touch of mystery, or at least a hope of mystery. The doctor, however, was not like other men. He was more similar to a precocious child, and she comforted herself in his obvious talent for silence. If he had been alert, strong, self-confident, she might have hated him because he knew so much about her. But when she noted the pale, thoughtful face, the vast forehead outbalancing the other features, and the wistful, uncertain eyes, she felt nothing towards him stronger than pity. It is good for a woman to have something which she may pity, a child, an aged parent, or a house dog. It provides in a way the background against which she acts. So Kate, when in doubt, turned to the doctor, as on this night. There was a certain cruelty in it, for when she smiled at him, the poor doctor became crimson, and when she talked to him, his answers stumbled on his tongue. And when she was silent and merely looked at him, that was the worst of all, for he became unable to manage knife and fork, and would sit crumbling bread and looking frightened. Then he was apt to draw out his glasses and make a move to place them on his nose, but he always caught and checked himself in time, which added to his embarrassment. These small maneuvers had not lasted long before the girl became aware that the silent attention of Whistling Dan had passed from her to the doctor, and held steadily upon him. She did not go so far as to call it jealousy, but certainly it was a grave and serious consideration that measured the doctor up and down and back again, and it left her free to examine the two men in contrast. For the first time it struck her that they were much alike in many ways. Physically, for instance, there was the same slenderness, the same delicacy with which details were finished, the same fragile hands, for instance. The distinction lay in a suggestion of strength and inexhaustible reserve of energy which Dan Barry possessed. The distinction lay still more in their faces. That of Byron was worn and pallid from the long quest and struggle for truth. The body was feeble, the eyes were uncertain, but within there was a powerful machine which could work infallibly from the small to the large and the large to the small. With Whistling Dan, there was no suggestion at all of mental care. She could not imagine him worrying over a problem. His knowledge was not even communicable by words. It was more impalpable than the instinct of a woman, and there was about him the wisdom and the coldness of Black Bart himself. The supper ended too soon for Kate. She had been rallying Randall Byron, and as soon as he could graciously leave, the poor fellow rose with a crimson face and left the room, and behind him, sauntering apparently in the most casual manner, went Whistling Dan. As for Kate Cumberland, she could not put all the inferences together. She dared not, but when she lay in her bed that night it was a long time before she could sleep, for there was a voice inside her singing. She chose her time the next day. Dan alternated between Black Bart and old Joe Cumberland during most of the day, and no sooner had he left the wolf dog in the morning than she went out to Bart. As always, Black Bart lay with his head flattened against the sand, dreaming in the sun, and not an eyelid quivered when she approached. Yet she understood perfectly that the animal knew every move she made. She would have attempted to dress the wound again, but the memory of the ordeal of yesterday was too terrible. She might break down in the midst of her effort, and the first sign of weakness, she knew, was the only spur which Black Bart needed. So she went instead to the chair where Dan often sat for hours near the dog, and there she took her place, folded her hands on her lap, and waited. She had no particular plan in mind, more than that she hoped to familiarize the great brute with the sight of her. Once he had known her well enough, but now he had forgotten all that passed before, as completely, no doubt, as Whistling Dan himself had forgotten. While she sat there musing, she remembered a scene that had occurred not many a month before. She had been out walking one fall day, and had gone from the house down past the corrals where a number of cattle newly driven in from the range were penned. They were to be driven off for shipment the next day. A bellowing caught her ear from one of the enclosures, and she saw two bulls standing horn to horn, their heads lowered, and their puffing and snorting breaths knocking up the dust while they pawed the sand back in clouds against their flanks. While she watched, they rushed together, bellowing, and for a moment they swayed back and forth. It was an unequal battle, however, for one of the animals was a hardened veteran, scarred from many a battle on the range, while the other was a young 3-year-old with a body not half so strong as his heart. For a short time he sustained the weight of the larger bull, but eventually his knees buckled and then dropped heavily against the earth. At that the older bull drew back a little and charged again. This time he avoided the long horns of his rival and made the unprotected flank of the animal his target. If he had charged squarely, the horns would have been buried to the head, but striking at an angle, only one of them touched the target and delivered a long, ripping blow. With the blood streaming down his side, the wounded bull made off into a group of cows, and when the victor pursued him closely, he at length turned tail and leaped the low fence, for the corral was a new one, hastily built for the occasion. The conqueror raised his head inside the fence and bellowed his triumph, and outside the fence the other commenced pawing up the sand again, switching his tail across his bleeding side, and turning his little red eyes here and there. They fixed at length upon Kate Cumberland, and she remembered with a start of horror that she was wearing a bright red blouse. The next instant the bull was charging. She turned in a hopeless flight. Safety was hundreds of yards away in the house. The skirts tangled about her legs, and behind her the dull impacts of the bull's hoofs swept close and closer. Then she heard a snarl in front, a deep-throated, murderous snarl, and she saw Black Bart racing towards her. He whizzed by her like a black thunderbolt. There was a roar and bellow behind her, and at the same time she stumbled over a fence board and fell upon her knees. But when she cast a glance of terror behind her, she saw the bull lying on its side with lolling tongue and glazing eyes, and the fangs of Black Bart were buried in its throat. When she reached this point in her musing, her glance naturally turned towards the wolf dog, and she started violently when she saw that Bart was slinking towards her, trailing the helpless leg. The moment he felt her eyes upon him, Bart dropped down, motionless, with a wicked baring of his teeth. His eyes closed, and he seemed, as usual, dreaming in the sun. Was the brute stalking her? It was worse in a way than the ordeal of the day before, this stealthy, noiseless approach, and in her panic she first thought of springing from her chair and reaching a distance which the chain would keep him from following. Yet it was very strange. Black Bart, in his wildest days, after Dan brought him to the ranch, had never been prone to wantonly attack human beings. Infringe upon his right, come suddenly upon him, and then, indeed, there was a danger to all saving his master. But this daylight stalking was stranger than words could tell. She forced her eyes to look straight ahead, and sat with a beating heart, waiting. Then, by slow degree, she let her glance travel cautiously back towards Bart without turning her head. There was no doubt about it. The great wolf dog was slinking towards her on his belly, still trailing the wounded foreleg. There was something snake-like in that slow approach, so silent and so gradual. and yet she waited, moving neither hand nor foot. A sort of nightmare paralysis held her, as when we flee from some horror in our dreams and find that our limbs have grown numb. Behind us races the deadly thing, closer and closer. Before us is the door of safety, only a step to reach it, and yet we cannot move a foot. It was not all pure terror. There was an incredible excitement as well, her will against the will of the dumb brute. Which would conquer? She heard a faint rustling of the sand beside her, and could hardly keep from turning her head again. But she succeeded. Waves of coldness broke on her mind. Her whole body would have shuddered had not fear chilled her into motionlessness. All reason told her that it was madness to sit there with the stealthy horror sliding closer. Even now it might be too late. If she rose, the shaggy form might spring from the ground at her. Perhaps the wolf had treasured up the pain from the day before, and now... A black form did indeed rise from the ground, but slowly. And standing on 3 legs, Bart stood a moment and stared in the face of the girl. The fear rushed out of her heart, and her face flushed hotly with relief. There was no enmity in the steady stare of the wolf-dog. She could feel that even though she did not look, something that Whistling Dan had said long before came to her. Even a hoss and a dog, Kate, can get terrible lonesome. Black Bart moved until he faced her directly. His ears were pricking in eagerness. She heard a snarl, but so low and muffled that there was hardly a threat in it. Could it be a plea for attention? She would not look down to the sharp eyes until a weight fell on her knees. It was the long, scarred head of the wolf. The joy that swelled in her was so great that it pained her like a grief. She stretched out her hands slowly, slowly towards that head, and Black Bart shrank and quivered, and his lips withered back from the long, deadly teeth, and his snarl grew to a harsher, hoarser threat. Still he did not remove his head, and he allowed the hand to touch him between the eyes and stroke the fur back to between the ears. Only one other hand had ever touched that formidable head in such a manner. The teeth no longer showed. The keen, suspicious eyes grew dim with pleasure. The snarl sank to murmur and then died out. "Bart," commanded the girl sharply. The head jerked up, but the questioning eyes did not look at her. He glanced over his shoulder to find the danger that had made her voice so hard, and she yearned to take the fierce head in her arms. There were tears she could have wept over it. He was snarling again, prepared already to battle, and for her sake. "Bart," she repeated more gently, "lie down." He turned his head slowly back to her and looked with that unspeakable wistfulness of the dumb brutes into her eyes. But there was only one voice in which Bart could speak, and that was the harsh, rattling snarl which would have made a mountain lion check itself mid-leap and slink back to its lair. In such a voice he answered Kate, and then sank down gradually, and he lay still. So simply and yet so mysteriously she was admitted to the partnership. But though one member of that swift, grim trio had accepted her, did it mean that the other 2 would take her in? A weight sank on her feet, and when she looked down she saw that Black Bart had lowered his head upon them, and so he lay there with his eyes closed, dreaming in the sun. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 28. The Trail. Bandages and antiseptics and constant care by themselves could not have healed Black Bart so swiftly, but nature took a strong hand. The wound closed with miraculous speed. 3 days after he had laid his head on the feet of Kate Cumberland, the wolf-dog was hobbling about on 3 legs and tugging now and again at the restraining chain. And the day after that, the bandages were taken off, and Whistling Dan decided that Bart might run loose. It was a brief ceremony, but a vital one. Dr. Byron went out with Barry to watch the loosening of the dog. From the window of Joe Cumberland's room, he and Kate observed what passed. There was little hesitancy in Black Bart. He merely paused to sniff the foot of Randall Byron, snarl, and then trotted with a limp towards the corral. Here, in a small enclosure, with rails much higher than the other corrals, stood Satan, and Black Bart made straight for the stallion. He was seen from afar, and the black horse stood waiting, his head thrown high in the air, his ears pricking forward, the tail flaunting, a picture of expectancy. So under the lower rail Bart slunk, and stood under the head of Satan, growling terribly. Of this display of anger the stallion took not the slightest notice, but lowered his beautiful head until his velvet nose touched the cold muzzle of Bart. There was something ludicrous about the greeting. It was such an odd shade close to the human. It was as brief as it was strange, for Black Bart at once whirled and trotted away towards the barns. By the time Dr. Byron and Whistling Dan caught up with him, the wolf dog was before the heaps and ashes which marked the site of the burned barn. Among these white and gray and black heaps he picked his way, sniffing hastily here and there. In the very center of the place he sat down suddenly on his haunches, pointed his nose aloft, and wailed with tremendous dreariness. "Now," murmured the doctor to Dan, "that strikes me as a singular manifestation of intelligence in an animal. He has found the site of the very barn where he was hurt. Upon my word, even fire doesn't affect his memory." Here he observed that the face of Whistling Dan had grown grim. He ran to Bart and crouched beside him, muttering, and Byron heard. "That's about where you was lying," said Dan, "and you smell your own blood on the ground. Keep trying, Bart. There's something else to find around here." The wolf dog looked his master full in the face with prickling ears, whined, and then started off, sniffing busily at the heaps of ashes. "The shooting of the dog is quite a mystery," said Byron, by way of conversation. "Do you suppose that one of the men from the bunkhouse could have shot him?" But Dan seemed no longer aware of the doctor's presence. He slipped here and there with the wolf dog among the ash heaps, pausing when Bart paused, talking to the brute continually. Sometimes he pointed out to Bart things which the doctor did not perceive, and Bart whined with a terrible, slavering, blood eagerness. The wolf dog suddenly left the ash heaps, and now darted in swiftly entangled lines here and there among the barns. Dan Barry stood thoughtfully still, but now and then he called a word of encouragement. And Black Bart stayed with his work. Now he struck out a wide circle, running always with his nose close to the ground. Again he doubled back sharply to the barn site, and began again in a new direction. He ran swiftly, sometimes putting his injured leg to the ground with hardly a limp, and again drawing it up and running on 3 feet. In a moment he passed out of sight behind a slight rise of ground to the left of the ash heaps, and, at some little distance, he did not reappear. Instead, a long, shrill wail came wavering toward the doctor and Dan Barry. It raised the hair on the head of the doctor and sent a chill through his veins, but it sent Whistling Dan racing towards the place behind which Black Bart had disappeared. The doctor hurried after as fast as he might, and came upon the wolf dog making small, swift circles, his nose to the ground, and then crossing to and fro out of the circle. And the face of the master was black while he watched. He ran again to Bart and began talking swiftly. "Do you see?" he asked, pointing. "From behind this here hill you could get a pretty good sight of the barn, and you wouldn't be seen, hardly, from the barn. Someone must have waited here. Look about, Bart. you'll be finding a pile of signs around here. It means that them that done the shooting and the firing of the barn stood right here behind this hilltop and watched the barn burn, and was hoping that Satan and you wouldn't never come out alive. That's the story." He dropped to his knees and caught Bart as the big dog ran by. "Find 'em, Bart," he whispered. "Find 'em." And he struck sharply on the scar where the bullet had plowed its way into Bart's flesh. The answer of Bart was a yelp too sharp and too highly pitched to have come from the throat of any mere dog. Once more he darted out and ran here and there, and Dr. Byron heard the beast moaning as it ran. Then Bart ceased circling and cut down the slope away from the hill at a sharp trot. A cry of inarticulate joy burst from Dan, and then, "You found it, you have it," and the master ran swiftly after the dog. He followed the latter only for a short distance down the slope, and then stood still and whistled. He had to repeat the call before the dog turned and ran back to his master, where he whined eagerly about the man's feet. There was something uncanny and horrible about it. It was as if the dumb beast was asking for a life, and the life of a man. The doctor turned back and walked thoughtfully to the house. At the door he was met by Kate and a burst of eager questions, and he told simply all that he had seen. "You'll get the details from Mr. Barry," he concluded. "I know the details," answered the girl. "He's found the trail, and he knows where it points now, and he'll want to be following it before many hours have passed. Dr. Byron, I need you now, terribly. You must convince Dan that if he leaves us, it will be a positive danger to Dad. Can you do that?" "At least," said the doctor, "there will be little deception in that. I will do what I can to persuade him to stay." "Then," she said hurriedly, "sit here, and I shall sit here. We'll meet Dan together when he comes in." They had hardly taken their places when Barry entered, the wolf at his heels. At the door he paused to flash a glance at them, and then crossed the room. On the farther side he stopped again. "I might be telling you," he said in his soft voice, "that now Bart's got well, I got to be traveling again. I start in the morning." The pleading eyes of Kate raised Byron to his feet. "My dear Mr. Barry," he called. The other turned again and waited. "Do you mean that you will leave us while Mr. Cumberland is in this critical condition?" A shadow crossed the face of Barry. "I'd stay if I could," he answered, "but it ain't possible." "What takes you away is your affair, sir," said the doctor. "My concern is Mr. Cumberland. He is in a very precarious condition. The slightest nerve shock may have fatal results." Dan Barry sighed. "Seems to me," he answered, "that he was bucking up considerable. Don't look so thin, Doc." "His body may be well enough," said the doctor calmly, "but his nerves are wrecked. I'm afraid to prophesy the consequences if you leave him." It was apparent that a great struggle was going on in Barry. He answered at length, "How long would I have to stay? One rain could wipe out all the sign and make me like a blind man in the desert. Doc, how long would I have to stay?" "A few days," answered Byron, "may work wonders with him." "I'll go up and talk with him," he said, "and what he wants, I'll do." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 29. Talk. He was long in getting his answer. The hours dragged on slowly for Kate and the doctor, for if Joe Cumberland could hold Dan, it was everything to the girl, and if Barry left at once, there might be some root for the hope which was growing stronger and stronger every day in the heart of Randall Byron. Before evening a not unwelcome diversion broke the suspense somewhat. It was the arrival of no less a person than Marshal Jeff Calkins. His shoulders were humped, and his short legs bowed from continual riding, and his head was slung far forward on a gaunt neck, so that when he turned his head from one to another in speaking, it was with a peculiar pendulum motion. The marshal had a reputation which was strong over the 300 miles and more of a mountain desert. This was strange, for the marshal was a very talkative man, and talkative men are not popular on the desert. But it has been discovered that on occasion his six-gun could speak as rapidly and much more accurately than his tongue. So Marshal Calkins waxed in favor. He set the household at ease upon his arrival by announcing that they had nothing for him there. All he wanted was a place to bunk in, some chow, and feed for the horse. His trail led past the Cumberland Ranch many and many a dreary mile. The marshal was a politic man, and he had early in life discovered that the best way to get along with any man was to meet him on his own ground. His opening blast of words at Dr. Byron was a sample of his art. "So you're a doc, eh? Well, sir, when I was a kid I had a colt that stuck its foreleg in a hole and busted it short, and when that colt had to be shot there was no holding me. No, sir, I could have cleaned up on the whole family. And ever since then I've had a hankering to be a doc. Something about the idea of cutting into a man that always sort of tickled me. There's only one main thing that holds me back. I don't like the idea of knifing a fella when he ain't got a chance to fight back." To this Dr. Randall Byron bowed, rather dazed, but returned no answer. "And how's your patient, Doc?" pursued the irresistible marshal. "How's old Joe Cumberland? I remember when me and Joe used to trot about the range together. I was sort of a kid then. But think of old Joe being down in bed, sick. Why, I ain't never been sick a day in my life. Sick? I'd laugh myself plumb to death if anybody ever wanted me to go to bed. What's the matter with him, anyway?" "His nerves are a bit shaken about," responded the doctor, "to which I might add that there is superimposed an arterial condition." "Cut it short, Doc," cried the marshal good-naturedly. "I ain't got a dictionary handy. Nerves bad, eh? Well, I don't wonder about that. The old man's had enough trouble lately to make anybody nervous. I wouldn't like to go through it myself, no, sir, what with that Dan Barry. I ain't stepping on any corns, Kate, am I?" She smiled vaguely, but the marshal accepted the smile as a strong dissent. "There was a time not long ago when folks said that you was kind of sweet on Dan. Glad to hear there ain't nothing in it. 'S a matter of fact—" But here Kate interrupted with a raised hand. She said, "I think that was the supper gong. Yes, there it is. We'll go in now, if you wish." "There's only one sound in the world that's better to me than a dinner gong," said the profuse marshal, as they seated themselves around the big dining-room table, "and that was the sound of my wife's voice when she said 'I will.' Queer thing, too. Maria ain't got a very soft voice, most generally speaking, but when she busted up in front of that preacher and says, 'I will,' why, God Almighty, asking your pardon, Kate, there was a change come in her voice that was like a bell chiming down in her throat, a bell ringing away off far, you know, so you only kind of guess at it. But coming back to you and Dan, Kate." It was in vain she plied the marshal with edibles. His tongue wagged upon roller bearings and knew no stopping. Moreover, the marshal had spent some portion of his life in a boarding-house and had mastered the boarding-house art of talking while he ate. "Coming back to you and Dan, we was all of us saying that you and Dan kind of had an eye for each other. I suppose we was all wrong. You see, that was back in the days before Dan busted loose. When he was about the range, most usually he was the quietest man I ever sat opposite to, barrin' one, and that was a fellow that went west with a bum heart at the chuck table. Ha, ha, ha!" The marshal's laughter boomed through the big room as he recalled this delightful anecdote. He went on, "But after that Jim Silent play, we all changed our minds some. Do you know, Doc, I was in Elkhead the night that Dan got our Lee Haines." "I've never heard of the episode," murmured the doctor. You ain't? Well, I'll be damned, asking your pardon, Kate, but you sure ain't lived in these parts long. Which you wouldn't think one man could ride into a whole town, go to the jail, knock out 2 guards that was proved men, take the keys, unlock the irons off the man he wanted, saddle a hoss, and ride through a whole town full of folks that was shooting at him. Now, would you think that was possible? Certainly not. And it ain't possible, I'm here to state. But there was something different about Dan Barry. Did you ever notice it, Kate? She was far past speech. No, I guess you never would have noticed it. You was living too close to him all the time to see how different he was from other fellas. Anyway, he done it. They say he got plugged while he was riding through the lines, and he bled all the way home, and he got there unconscious. Is that right, Kate? He waited an instant, and then accepted the silence as an affirmative. Funny thing about that, too. The place where he come to was Buck Daniels' house. Well, Buck was one of Jim Silent's men, and they say Buck had tried to plug Dan before that. But Dan let him go that time, and when Buck seen Dan ride in all covered with blood, he remembered that favor, and he kept Dan safe from Jim Silent and safe from the law until Dan was well. I seen Buck this morning over to Rafferty's place, and—" Here the marshal noted a singular look in the eyes of Kate Cumberland, a look so singular that he turned in his chair to follow it. He saw Dan Barry in the act of closing the door behind him, and Marshal Calkins turned a deep and violent red, varied instantly by a blotchy yellow, which in turn faded to something as near white as his tan permitted. Dan Barry, gasped the marshal, rising, and he reached automatically towards his hips before he remembered that he had laid his belt and guns aside before he entered the dining room, as etiquette is in the mountain desert, for it is held that shooting at the table disturbs the appetite. "Good evening," said Dan quietly. "Was it Buck Daniels that you seen at Rafferty's place, Marshal Calkins?" "Him," nodded the marshal hoarsely. "Yep, Buck Daniels." And then he sank into his chair, silent for the first time. His eyes followed Barry as though hypnotized. "I'm kind of glad to know where I can find him," said Barry, and took his place at the table. The silence continued for a while, with all eyes focused on the newcomer. It was the doctor who had to speak first. "You talked things over with Mr. Cumberland?" he asked. "We had a long talk," nodded Dan. "You was wrong about him, Doc. He thinks he can do without me." "What?" cried Kate. "He thinks he can do without me," said Dan Barry. "We talked it all over." The silence fell again. Kate Cumberland was staring blankly down at her plate, seeing nothing, and Dr. Byrne looked straight before him and felt his pulse drumming in his throat. His chance then was to come. By this time the marshal had recovered his breath. He said to Dan, "Seems like you've been away some time, Dan. Where you been hanging out?" "I've been riding about," answered Dan vaguely. "Well," chuckled the marshal, "I'm glad there ain't no more Jim Silents about these parts. Not while you're here and while I'm here. You kept things kind of busy for Glasgow, Dan." He turned to Kate, who had pushed back her chair. "What's the matter, Kate?" he boomed. "You ain't looking too tip-top sick." "I may be back in a moment," said the girl, "but don't delay supper for me." She went out of the room with a step poised well enough, but the moment the door closed behind her, she fairly staggered to the nearest chair and sank into it, her head fallen back, her eyes dim, and all the strength gone from her body and her will. Several minutes passed before she roused herself, and then it was to drag herself slowly up the stairs to the door of her father's room. She opened it without knocking, and then closed it, and stood with her back against it, in the shadow. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 30. The Voice of Black Bart. Her father lay propped high with pillows among which his head lolled back. The only light in the room was near the bed, and it cast a glow upon the face of Joe Cumberland, and on the white linen, the white hair, the white pointed beard. All the rest of the room swam in darkness. The chairs were blotches, indistinct, uncertain. Even the foot of the bed trailed off to nothingness. It was like one of those impressionistic, very modern paintings, where the artist centers upon one point and throws the rest of his canvas into dull oblivion. The focus here was the face of the old cattleman. The bedclothes, never stirred, lay in folds sharply cut out with black shadows, and they had a solid seeming, as the mort cloth rendered in marble over the effigy. That suggested weight exaggerated the frailty of the body beneath the clothes. Exhausted by that burden, the old man lay in the arms of a deadly languor, so that there was a kinship of more than blood between him and Kate at this moment. She stepped to the side of the bed and stood staring down at him, and there was little gentleness in her expression. So cold was that settled gaze that her father stirred at length, shivered, and without opening his eyes, fumbled at the bedspread and drew it a little more closely about his shoulders. Even that did not give him rest. Presently the wrinkled eyelids opened, and he looked up at his daughter. A film of weariness, heavier than sleep, at first obscured his sight, but this in turn cleared away. He frowned a little to clear his vision, and then wagged his head slowly from side to side. "Kate," he said feebly, "I done my best. It simply wasn't good enough." She answered in a voice as low as his, but steadier. "What could have happened? Dad? What happened to make you give up every hold on Dan? What was it? You were the last power that could keep him here. You knew it. Why did you tell him he could go?" The monotone was more deadly than any emphasis of a raised word. "If you'd been here," pleaded Joe Cumberland, "you'd have done what I done. I couldn't help it. There he sat at the foot of the bed. See where them covers still kind of sagged down. After he told me that he had something to do away from the ranch, and that he wanted to go now that Black Bart was well enough to travel in short spells, he asked me if I still needed him." "And you told him no?" she cried. "Oh, Dad, you know it means everything to me. But you told him no." He raised a shaking hand to ward off the outburst and stop it. "Not at first, honey. Give me a chance to talk, Kate. At first I told him that I needed him, and God knows that I do need him. I don't know why. Not even Dr. Byron knows what there is about Dan that helps me. I told Dan all them things, and he didn't say nothing, but just sat still on the foot of the bed and looked at me. It ain't easy to bear his eyes, Kate. I lay here and tried at first to smile at him and talk about other things, but it ain't easy to bear his eyes. You take a dog, Kate. It ain't supposed to be able to look you in the eyes for long. But suppose you met up with a dog that could. It'd make you feel sort of queer inside, which I felt that way while Dan was looking at me. Not that he was threatening me. No, it wasn't that. He was only thoughtful, but I kept getting more nervous and more fidgety. I felt after a while like I couldn't stand it. I had to crawl out of bed and began walking up and down till I got quieter. But I seen that wouldn't do. Then I begun to think. I thought of near everything in a little while. I thought of what would happen. Suppose Dan should stay here. Maybe you and him would get to like each other again. Maybe you'd get married. Then what would happen? I thought of the wild geese flying north in the spring of the year, and the wild geese flying south in the fall of the year, and I thought of Dan with his heart following the wild geese, God knows why, and I seen a picture of him standing and watching them, with you nearby, and not able to get one look out of him. I seen that, and it made my blood chilly, like the air on a frosty night. Kate, there's something like the power of prophecy that comes to a dying man. "Dad," she cried, "what are you saying?" She slipped to her knees beside the bed and drew his cold hands toward her, but Joe Cumberland shook his head and mildly drew one hand away. He raised it with extended forefinger, a sign of infinite warning, and with the glow of the lamp full upon his face, the eyes were pits of shadow, with stirring orbs of fire in the depths. "No, I ain't dead now," he said, "but I ain't far away from it. Maybe days, maybe weeks, maybe whole months, but I've passed the top of the hill, and I know I'm riding down the slope. Pretty soon I'll finish the trail, but what little time I've got left is worth more than everything that went before. I can see my life behind me, and the things before like a cold morning light was over it all. You know, before the sun begins to beat up the waves of heat, and the mist gets tangling in front of your eyes. You know, when you can look right across the 30-mile valley and name the trees most on the other side. That's the way I can see now. There ain't no feeling about it. My body is all plumb paralyzed. I just see and know. That's all. And what I see of you and Dan, if you ever marry, is plain hell. Love ain't the only thing that is between a man and a woman. There's something else. I don't know what it is, but it's sort of a common purpose. It's having both pairs of feet stepping out on the same path. That's what it is. But your trail would go one way, and Dan's would go another, and pretty soon your love wouldn't be nothing but a big wind blowing between two mountains, and all it would do would be to freeze up the blood in your hearts. I seen all that while Dan was sitting at the foot of the bed. Not that I don't want him here. When I see him, I see the world the way it was when I was under 30. When there wasn't nothing I wouldn't try once. When all I wanted was a gun and a hoss and a song to keep me from trading with kings. No, it ain't going to be easy for me when Dan goes away. But what's my tag end of life compared with yours? You've got to be given a chance. You've got to be kept away from Dan. That's why I told him, finally, that I thought I could get along without him. Whether or not you save me, she answered, you signed the death warrant for at least 2 men when you told him that. 2 men? There's only one he's after, and Buck Daniels has had a long start. He can't be caught. That Marshal Calkins is here tonight. He saw Buck at Rafferty's, and he talked about it in the hearing of Dan at the table. I watched Dan's face. You may read the past and see the future, Dad, but I know Dan's face. I can read it as a sailor reads the sea. Before tomorrow night, Buck Daniels will be dead, and Dan's hands will be red. She dropped her head against the bedclothes and clasped her fingers over the bright hair. When she could speak again, she raised her head and went on in the same swift, low monotone. And besides, Black Bart has found the trail of the man who fired the barn and shot him, and the body of Buck won't be cold before Dan will be on the heels of the other man. Oh, Dad, 2 lives lay in the hollow of your hand. You could have saved them by merely asking Dan to stay with you, but you've thrown them away. Buck Daniels, repeated the old man, the horror of the thing dawning on him slowly. Why didn't he get farther away? Why didn't he ride night and day after he left us? He's got to be warned that Dan is coming. I've thought of that. I'm going into my room now to write a note and send it to Buck by one of our men. But at the most he'll have less than a day's start. And what is a day to Satan and Dan Barry? I thought it was for the best, muttered old Joe. I couldn't see how it was wrong. But I can send for Dan and tell him that I've changed my mind. He broke off in a groan. No, that wouldn't be no good. He's set his mind on going by this time, and nothing can keep him back. But, Kate, maybe I can delay him. Has he gone up to his room yet? He's there now. Talk softly, or he'll hear us. He's walking up and down now. Aye, nodded old Joe, his eyes widening with horror, and his footfalls is like the padding of a big cat. I could tell it out of 1,000 steps, and I know what's going on inside his mind. Yes, yes, he's thinking of the blow Buck Daniels struck him. He's thinking of the man who shot down Bart. God save them both. Listen, whispered the cattleman. He's raised the window. I heard the rattle of the weights. He's standing there in front of the window, letting the wind of the night blow in his face. The wind from the window, indeed, struck against the door communicating with Joe Cumberland's room, and shook it as if a hand were rattling at the knob. The girl began to speak again, as swiftly as before, her voice the barely audible rushing of a whisper. The law will trail him, but I won't give him up. Dad, I'm going to fight once more to keep him here. And if I fail, I'll follow him around the world. Such words should have come loudly, ringing. Spoken so softly, they gave a terrible effect, like the ravings of delirium or the monotone of insanity. And with the white light against her face, she was more awe-inspiring than beautiful. He loved me once, and the fire must still be in him. Such fire can't go out, and I'll fan it back to life, and then, if it burns me, if it burns us both, the fire itself cannot be more torture than to live on like this. Hush, lass, murmured her father. Listen to what's coming. It was a moan, very low-pitched, and then rising slowly and gaining in volume, rising up the scale with a dizzying speed till it burst and rang through the house. The long, drawn wail of a wolf when it hunts on a fresh trail. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand, Chapter 31. The Message. Buck Daniels opened his eyes and sat bolt upright in bed. He had dreamed the dream again, and this time, as always, he awakened before the end. He needed no rubbing of eyes to rouse his senses. If a shower of cold water had been dashed upon him, he could not have rallied from sound slumber so suddenly. His first movement was to snatch his gun from under his mattress. Not that he dreamed of needing it, but for some reason the pressure of the butt against his palm was reassuring. It was better than the grip of his friend, a strong man. It was the first gray of dawn, a light so feeble that it served merely to illuminate the darkness, so to speak. It fell with any power upon one thing alone, the bit of an old dusty bridle that hung against the wall, and it made the steel glitter like a watchful eye. There was a great dryness in the throat of Buck Daniels, and his whole big body shook with the pounding of his heart. He was not the only thing that was awake in the gray hour, for now he caught a faint and regular creaking of the stairs. Someone was mounting with an excessively cautious and patient step, for usually the crazy stairs that led up to this garret room of the Rafferty house creaked and groaned a protest at every footfall. Now the footfall paused at the head of the stairs, as when one stops to listen. Buck Daniels raised his revolver and leveled it on the door, but his hand was shaking so terribly that he could not keep his aim. The muzzle kept veering back and forth across the door. He seized his right hand with his left and crushed it with a desperate pressure. Then it was better. The quivering of the two hands counteracted each other, and he managed to keep some sort of a bead. Now the step continued again, down the short hall. A hand fell on the knob of the door and pressed it slowly open. Against the deeper blackness of the hall beyond, Buck saw a tall figure, hatless. His finger curved about the trigger, and still he did not fire. Even to his hysterical brain it occurred that Dan Barry would be wearing a hat, and moreover the form was tall. "Buck," called a guarded voice. The muzzle of Daniel's revolver dropped. He threw the gun on his bed and stood up. "Jim Rafferty," he cried, with something like a groan in his voice, "what in the name of God are you doing here at this hour?" "Someone come here and banged on the door a while ago. He had a letter for you. Must have rid a long ways and come fast. While he was giving me the letter at the door, I heard his hoss panting outside. He wouldn't stay, but went right back. Here's the letter, Buck. Hope it ain't no bad news. Got a light here, ain't you?" "All right, Jim," answered Buck Daniels, taking the letter. "I got a lantern. You get back to bed." The other replied with a noisy yawn and left the room, while Buck kindled the lantern. By that light he read his name upon the envelope and tore it open. It was very brief. "Dear Buck, last night at supper Dan found out where you are. In the morning he's leaving the ranch, and we know he intends to ride for Rafferty's place. He'll probably be there before noon. The moment you get this, saddle your horse and ride. Oh, Buck, why did you stay so close to us? Relay your horses. Don't stop until you're over the mountains. Black Bart is well enough to take the trail, and Dan will use him to follow you. You know what that means. Ride, ride, ride. Kate." He crumpled up the paper and sank back upon the bed. Why did you stay so close? He had wondered at that himself many times in the past few days. Like the hunted rabbit, he expected to find safety under the very nose of danger. Now that he was discovered, it seemed incredible that he could have followed so patently a foolish course. In a sort of a daze he uncrumpled the note again and read the wrinkled writing word by word. He had leaned close to read by the uncertain light, and now he caught the faintest breath of perfume from the paper. It was a small thing, smaller among scents than a whisper is among voices, but it made Buck Daniels drop his head and crush the paper against his face. It was a moment before he could uncrumple the paper sufficiently to study the contents of the note thoroughly. At first his dazed brain caught only part of the significance. Then it dawned on him that the girl thought he had fled from the Cumberland ranch through fear of Dan Barry. Aye, there had been fear in it. Every day at the ranch he had shuddered at the thought that the destroyer might ride up on that devil of black silk and grace, Satan. But every day he had convinced himself that even then Dan Barry remembered the past and was cursing himself for the ingratitude he had shown his old friend. Now the truth swept coldly home to Buck Daniels. Barry was as fierce as ever upon the trail, and Kate Cumberland thought that he, Buck Daniels, had fled like a cur from danger. He seized his head between his hands and beat his knuckles against the corrugated flesh of his forehead. She had thought that. Desire for action, action, action beset him like thirst. To close with this devil, this wolf-man, to set his big fingers in the smooth, almost girlish throat, to choke the yellow light out of those eyes, or else to die, but like a man proving his manhood before the girl. He read the letter again, and then in agony he crumpled it to a ball and hurled it across the room. Catching up his hat and his belt, he rushed wildly from the room, thundered down the crazy stairs and out to the stable. Long Bess, the tall bay mare which had carried him through 3 years of adventure and danger and never failed him yet, raised her aristocratic head above the side of the stall and whinnied. For answer he shook his fist at her and cursed insanely. The saddle he jerked by one stirrup leather from the wall and flung it on her back, and when she cringed to the far side of the stall he cursed her again bitterly and drew up the cinch with a lunge that made her groan. He did not wait to lead her to the door before mounting, but sprang into the saddle. Here he whirled her about and drove home the spurs. Cruel usage for Long Bess had never denied him the utmost of her speed and strength. At the mere sound of his voice, now half mad with fear and surprise, she sprang forward at full gallop, slipped, and almost sprawled on the floor, and then thundered out of the door. At once the soft, sandy soil received and deadened the impact of her hoofs. Off she flew through the gray of the morning, soundless as a racing ghost. Long Bess, there was good blood in her. She was as delicately limbed as an antelope, and her heart was as strong as the smooth muscles of her shoulders and hips. Yet to Buck Daniels her fastest gait seemed slower than a walk. Already his thoughts were flying far before. Already he stood before the ranch house, calling to Dan Barry. Aye, at the very door of the place they should meet, and one of them must die. And better by far that the blood of him who died should stain the hands of Kate Cumberland. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 32. Victory. The gray light which Buck Daniels saw that morning hardly brightened as the day grew, for the sky was overcast with sheeted mist, and through it a dull evening radiance filtered to the earth. Wung Lu, his celestial slant eyes now yellow with cold, built a fire on the big hearth in the living room. It was a roaring blaze, for the wood was so dry that it flamed as though soaked in oil, and tumbled a mass of yellow fire up the chimney. So bright was the fire, indeed, that its light quite overshadowed the meagre day which looked in at the window, and every chair cast its shadow away from the hearth. Later on Kate Cumberland came down the back stairs and slipped into the kitchen. "Have you seen Dan?" she asked the cook. "Wung Lu make nice fire," grinned the Chinaman. "Misser Dan in there." She thought for an instant. "Is breakfast ready, Wung?" "Pretty soon quick," nodded Wung Lu. "Then throw out the coffee or the eggs," she said quickly. "I don't want breakfast served yet. Wait till I send you word." As the door closed behind her, the eyebrows of Wung rose into perfect Roman arches. "Ho!" grunted Wung Lu. "Oh, ho!" In the hall, Kate met Randall Byron coming down the stairs. He was dressed in white, and had found a little yellow wildflower and stuck it in his buttonhole. He seemed 10 years younger than the day he rode with her to the ranch, and now he came to her with a quick step, smiling. "Dr. Byron," she said quietly, "breakfast will be late this morning. Also, I want no one to go into the living room for a while. Will you keep them out?" The doctor was instantly gone. "He hasn't gone yet?" he queried. "Not yet." The doctor sighed, and then, apparently following a sudden impulse, he reached his hand to her. "I hope something comes of it," he said. Even then she could not help a wan smile. "What do you mean by that, doctor?" The doctor sighed again. "If the inference is not clear," he said, "I'm afraid I cannot explain. But I'll try to keep everyone from the room." She nodded her thanks and went on, but passing the mirror in the hall, the sight of her face made her stop abruptly. There was no vestige of color in it, and the shadow beneath her eyes made them seem inhumanly large and deep. The bright hair, to be sure, waved over her head and coiled on her neck, but it was like a futile shaft of sunlight falling on a dreary moor in winter. She went on thoughtfully to the door of the living room, but there she paused again with her hand upon the knob, and while she stood there she remembered herself as she had been only a few months before, with the color flushing in her face and a continual light in her eyes. There had been little need for thinking then. One had only to let the wind and the sun strike on one and live. Then, in a quiet despair, she said to herself, "As I am, I must win or lose, as I am." And she opened the door and stepped in. She had been cold with fear and excitement when she entered the room to make her last stand for happiness. But once she was in, it was not so hard. Dan Barry lay on the couch at the far end of the room with his hands thrown under his head, and he was smiling in a way which she well knew. It had been a danger signal in the old days, and when he turned his face and said good morning to her, she caught the singular glimmer of yellow which sometimes came up behind his eyes. In reply to his greeting, she merely nodded, and then walked slowly to the window and turned her back to him. It was a one-tone landscape. Sky, hills, barns, earth, all was a single mass of lifeless gray. In such an atmosphere, old Homer had seen the wraiths of his dead heroes play again at the things they had done on earth. She noted these things with a blank eye, for 1,000 thoughts were leaping through her mind. Something must be done. There he lay in the same room with her. He had turned his head back, no doubt, and was staring at the ceiling as before, and the yellow glimmer was in his eyes again. Perhaps after this day she should never see him again. Every moment was precious beyond the price of gold, and yet there she stood at the window, doing nothing. But what could she do? Should she go to him and fall on her knees beside him and pour out her heart, telling him again of the old days? No, it would be like striking on a wooden bell. No echo would rise, and she knew beforehand the deadly blackness of his eyes. So Black Bart lay often in the sun, staring at infinite distance, and seeing nothing but his dreams of battle. What were appeals and what were words to Black Bart? What were they to Dan Barry? Yet once, by sitting still, the thought made her blood leap with a great joyous pulse that set her cheeks tingling. She waited till the first impulse of excitement had subsided, and then turned back and sat down in a chair near the fire. From a corner of her eye she was aware that Whistling Dan had turned his head again to await her first speech. Then she fixed her gaze on the wall of yellow flame. The impulse to speak to him was like a hand tugging to turn her around, and the words came up and swelled in her throat, but still she would not stir. In a moment of rationality she felt in an overwhelming wave of mental coldness the folly of her course, but she shut out the thought with a slight shudder. Silence to Dan Barry had a louder voice and more meaning than any words. Then she knew that he was sitting up on the couch. Was he about to stand and walk out of the room? For moment after moment he did not stir, and at length she knew with a breathless certainty that he was staring fixedly at her. The hand which was farthest from him and hidden, she gripped hard upon the arm of the chair. That was some comfort, some added strength. She now had the same emotion she had had when Black Bart slunk toward her under the tree. If a single perceptible tremor shook her, if she showed the slightest awareness of the subtle approach, she was undone. It was her only apparent unconsciousness which could draw either the wolf-dog or the master. She remembered what her father had told her of hunting young deer, how he had lain in the grass and thrust up a leg above the grass in sight of the deer, and how they would first run away but finally come back step by step, drawn by an invincible curiosity, until at length they were within range for a point-blank shot. Now she must concentrate on the flames of the fireplace, see nothing but them, think of nothing but the swiftly changing domes and walls and pinnacles they made. She leaned a little forward and rested her cheek upon her right hand, and thereby she shut out the sight of Dan Barry effectually. Also, it made a brace to keep her from turning her head towards him, and she needed every support, physical and mental. Still he did not move. Was he in truth looking at her, or was he staring beyond her at the gray sky which lowered past the window? The faintest creaking sound told her that he had risen slowly from the couch. Then not a sound, except that she knew, in some mysterious manner, that he moved, but whether towards her or towards the door she could not dream. But he stepped suddenly and noiselessly into the range of her vision, and sat down on a low bench at one side of the hearth. If the strain had been tense before, it now became terrible, for there he sat almost facing her, and looking intently at her. Yet she must keep all awareness of him out of her eyes. In the excitement, a strong pulse began to beat in the hollow of her throat, as if her heart were rising. She had won. She had kept him in the room. She had brought him to a keen thought of her, a Pyrrhic victory, for she was poised on the very edge of a cliff of hysteria. She began to feel the tremor of the hand which supported her cheek. If that should become visible to him, he would instantly know that all her apparent unconsciousness was a sham, and then she would have lost him truly. Something sounded at one of the doors, and then the door opened softly. She was almost glad of the interruption, for another instant might have swept away the last reserve of her strength. So this, then, was the end. But the footfall which sounded in the apartment was a soft, padding step, with a little scratching sound, light as a finger running on a frosty window-pane. And then a long, shaggy head slipped close to Whistling Dan. It was Black Bart. A wave of terror swept through her. She remembered another scene not many months before, when Black Bart had drawn his master away from her and led him south after the wild geese. The wolf dog had come again, like a demoniac spirit, to undo her plans. Only an instant, the crisis of a battle. Then the great beast turned slowly, faced her, slunk with his long stride closer, and then a cold nose touched the hand which gripped the arm of her chair. It gave her a welcome excuse for action of some sort. She reached out her hand slowly and touched the forehead of Black Bart. He winced back, and the long fangs flashed. Her hand remained tremulously poised in air. And then the long head approached again, cautiously, and once more she touched it. And since it did not stir, she trailed the tips of her fingers backwards towards the ears. Black Bart snarled again, but it was a sound so subdued as to be almost like the purring of a great cat. He sank down, and the weight of his head came upon her feet. Victory. In the full tide of conscious power, she was able to drop her hand from her face, raise her head, turn her glance carelessly upon Dan Barry. She was met by ominously glowing eyes, anger. At least it was not indifference. He rose and stepped in his noiseless way behind her, but he reappeared instantly on the other side and reached out his hand to where her fingers trailed limp from the arm of the chair. There he let them lie, white and cool, against the darkness of his palm. It was as if he sought in the hand for the secret of her power over the wolf dog. She let her head rest against the back of the chair and watched the nervous and sinewy hand upon which her own rested. She had seen those hands fixed in the throat of Black Bart himself once upon a time. A grim simile came to her. The tips of her fingers touched the paw of the panther. The steel, sharp claws were sheathed, but suppose once they were bared and clutched. Or she stood touching a switch which might loose, by the slightest motion, a terrific voltage. What would happen? Nothing. Presently the hand released her fingers, and Dan Barry stepped back and stood with folded arms, frowning at the fire. In the weakness which overcame her, in the grip of the wild excitement, she dared not stay near him longer. She rose and walked into the dining-room. "Serve breakfast now, Wong," she commanded, and at once the gong was struck by the cook. Before the long vibrations had died away, the guests were gathered around the table, and the noisy marshal was the first to come. He slammed back a chair and sat down with a grunt of expectancy. "Mornin', Dan," he said, wetting his knife across the tablecloth. "I hear you're riding this morning. Ain't going my way, are you?" Dan Barry sat frowning steadily down at the table. It was a moment before he answered. "I ain't leaving," he said softly at length. "Postponed my trip." End of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 33. Dr. Byron shows the truth. On this day of low-lying mists, this day so dull that not a shadow was cast by tree or house or man, there was no graver place than the room of old Joe Cumberland. Even lamplight was more merciful in the room, for it left the corners of the big apartment in obscurity. But this meager daylight stripped away all illusion and left the room naked and ugly. Those colors of wall and carpet, once brighter than spring, showed now as faded and lifeless as foliage in the dead days of late November, when the leaves have no life except what keeps them clinging to the twig, and when their falling fellows are lifted and rustled on the ground by every faint wind, with a sound like breathing in the forest. And like autumn, too, was the face of Joe Cumberland, with a color neither flushed nor pale, but a dull sallow which foretells death. Beside his bed sat Dr. Randall Byron, and kept the pressure of 2 fingers upon the wrist of the rancher. When he removed the thermometer from between the lips of Cumberland, the old man spoke, but without lifting his closed eyelids, as even this were an effort which he could only accomplish by a great concentration of will. "No fever today, Doc?" "You feel a little better?" asked Byron. Dr. Byron glanced down at the thermometer with a frown, and then shook down the mercury. "No," he admitted, "there is no fever." Joe Cumberland opened his eyes a trifle and peered up at Byron. "You ain't satisfied, Doc?" Dr. Randall Byron was of that merciless modern school which believes in acquainting the patient with the truth. "I am not," he said. Murmured the sick man. "And what might be wrong?" "Your pulse is uneven and weak," said the doctor. "I've been feeling sort of weak since I seen Dan last night," admitted the other. "But the news Kate brought me will bring me up. She's kept him here, lad. Think of that." "I am thinking of it," answered the doctor coldly. "Your last interview with him nearly killed you. If you see him again, I shall wash my hands of the case. When he first came, you felt better at once. In fact, I admit that you seemed to do better, both in body and mind. But the thing could not last. It was a false stimulus, and when the first effects had passed away, it left you in this condition. Mr. Cumberland, you must see him no more." But Joe Cumberland laughed long and softly. "Life," he murmured, "ain't worth that much, not half." "I can do no more than advise," said the doctor, as reserved as before. "I cannot command." "A bit peeved, Doc?" queried the old man. "Well, sir, I know they ain't much longer for me. Lord, man, I can feel myself going out like a flame in a lamp when the oil runs up. I can feel life just making its last few jumps in me, like the flame up the chimney. But listen to me." He reached out a long, large-knuckled, claw-like hand and drew the doctor down over him, and his eyes were earnest. "I got to live till I see him standing here beside me, hand in hand, Doc." The doctor, even by that dim light, had changed color. He passed his hand slowly across his forehead. "You expect to see that?" "I expect nothing. I only hope." The bitterness of Byron's heart came up in his throat. "It will be an oddly suited match," he said, "if they marry. But they will not marry." "Ha!" cried Cumberland, and starting up in bed, he braced himself on a quaking elbow. "What's that?" "Lie down," ordered the doctor, and pressed the ranchman back against the pillows. "But what do you mean?" "It would be a long story, the scientific explanation. Doc, where Dan is concerned, I've got more patience than Job. In brief, then, I will prove to you that there is no mystery in this Daniel Barry. If you can do that, Doc, you're more of a man than I have been guessing you for. Start now." "In primitive times," said Dr. Randall Byron, "man was nearly related to what we now call the lower animals. In those days he could not surround himself with an artificial protective environment. He depended on the unassisted strength of his body. His muscular and sensuous development, therefore, was far in advance of that of the modern man, for modern man has used his mind at the expense of his body. The very quality of his muscles is altered, and the senses of sight and hearing, for instance, are much blunted. For in the primitive days the ear kept guard over man even when he slept, in terror of 1,000 deadly enemies, each stronger than he, and the eye had to be keenly attuned to probe the shadows of the forest for lurking foes. Now, sir, there is in biology the thing known as the sport. You will have heard that all living organisms undergo gradual processes of change. Season by season and year by year, environment affects the individual. Yet these gradual changes are extremely slow. Between steps of noticeable change, there elapse periods many times longer than the life of historic man. All speed in changes such as these comes in what we call sports. That is, a particular plant, for instance, gradually tends to have fewer leaves and a thicker bark. But the change is slight from age to age, until suddenly a single instance occurs of plant which realizes suddenly in a single step the ideal towards which the species has been striving. In a word, it has very, very few leaves and an extraordinarily thick bark. For a particular instance, one species of orange tended to have fewer and fewer seeds, but finally came an orange tree whose fruit had no seeds at all. That was the origin of the navel orange, and that was a typical sport. Now, there is the reverse of the sport. Instead of jumping long distance ahead, an individual may lapse back towards the primitive. That individual is called an atavism. For instance, in this mountain desert, there has, for several generations, been a pressure of environment calling for a species of man which will be able to live with comparative comfort in a waste region. A man, in a word, equipped with such powerful organisms that he will be as much at home in the heart of the desert as an ordinary man would be in a drawing-room. You gather the drift of my argument? I have observed this man very carefully. I am thoroughly convinced that he is such an atavism. Among other men he seems strange. He is different, and therefore he seems mysterious. As a matter of fact, he is quite a common freak. I could name you others like him in differing from common men, though not differing from them in exactly the same manner. You see the result of this? Dan Barry is a man to whom the desert is necessary, because he was made for the desert. He is lonely among crowds, you have said it yourself, but he is at home in a mountain wilderness with a horse and a dog. Doc, you talk well, broke in Joe Cumberland. But if he ain't human, why do humans like him so much? Why does he mean so much to me, to Kate? Simply because he is different. You get from him what you could get from no other man in the world, perhaps, and you fail to see that the fellow is really more akin to his wolf dog than he is to a man. Supposing I said you was right, murmured the old man, frowning. How do you explain why he likes other folks? According to you, the desert and the mountains and animals is what he wants. Then how is it that he took so much care of me when he come back this time? How is it that he likes Kate enough to give up a trail of blood to stay here with her? It's easy to explain the girl's attraction, said the doctor. All animals wish to mate, Mr. Cumberland, and an age-old instinct is now working out in Dan Barry. But while you and Kate may please him, you are not necessary to him. He left you once before, and he was quite happy in his desert. And I tell you, Mr. Cumberland, that he will leave you again. You cannot tame the untamable. It is not habit that rules this man. It is instinct 1,000,000 years old. The call which he will hear is the call of the wilderness, and to answer it he will leave father and wife and children, and ride out with his horse and his dog. The old man lay quite motionless, staring at the ceiling. I don't want to believe you, he said slowly, but before God, I think you're right. Oh, lad, why was I bound up in a tangle like this one? And Kate? What will she do? The doctor was quivering with excitement. Let the man stay with her. In time she will come to see the brute nature of Daniel Barry. That will be the end of him with her." "Brute, Doc. There ain't nobody as gentle as Dan." "Till he tastes blood. A lion can be raised like a house dog," answered the doctor. "Then she mustn't marry him. I felt it, just what you put into words. It's live and death for Kate if she marries him. She's kept him here today. Tomorrow something may cross him, and the minute he feels the pull of it, he'll be off on the trail. The blow of a man, the hollering of the wild geese, God knows what it'll take to start him wild again and forget us all, just the way a child forgets its parents." A voice broke in upon them, calling far away, "Dan? Dan Barry?" End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand, Chapter 34. The Acid Test. In the living room below they heard it, Dan and Kate Cumberland. All day she had sat by the fire which still blazed on the hearth, replenished from time to time by the care of Wung Lu. She had taken up some sewing, and she worked at it steadily. Some of that time Dan Barry was in the room, sitting through long intervals, watching her with lynx-eyed attention. Very rarely did he speak, almost never, and she could have numbered upon her two hands the words he had spoken. Aye, and she could have repeated them one by one. Now and again he rose and went out, and the wolf-dog went with him each time. But towards the last, Black Bart preferred to stay in the room, crouched in front of her, blinking at the fire, as if he knew that each time his master would return to the fire. Then why leave the pleasant warmth for the chilly grayness of the day outside? There he remained, stirring only now and then to lift the clumsy paw and brush it across his eyes in an oddly human gesture. Once or twice, also, he lifted that great scarred head and laid it on her knees, looking curiously from her busy hands to her face, and from her face back again to her work, until, having apparently assured himself that all was well, he dropped his head again and lay once more motionless. She could see him open a listless eye when the master entered the room again, and with each coming of Dan Barry she felt again surrounded, as if by invisible arms. Something was prying at her, striving to win a secret from her. As the day wore on, a great singing happiness rose in her throat. At about the same time she heard a faint sound, impalpable, from the farther side of the room where Dan Barry sat. He was whistling. A simple thing for a man to do, to be sure, but the astonishment of it nearly stopped the heart of Kate Cumberland, for in all her life she had never before heard him whistle except when he was in the open, and preferably when he was astride of the strength and the speed of Satan, with Black Bart scouting swiftly and smoothly ahead. But now he whistled here by the warmth of the fire. To be sure, the sound was small and thin, but there was such music in it as she had never heard before. It was so thin that it was almost ghostly, as if the soul of wild Paganini played here on a muted violin. No tune that might be repeated, but as always when she heard it, a picture rose before the eyes of Kate. It wavered at first against the yellow glow of the firelight, then it quite shut out all else. It was deep night, starry night. The black horse and his rider wound up a deep ravine. To one side a bold mountain tumbled up to infinite height, bristling with misshapen trees here and there, and losing its head against the very stars. On the other side were jagged hills, all carved in the solid rock. And down the valley, between the mountains and the stars, blew a soft wind, as if that wind made the music. They were climbing up, 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 and now they reached, the music rising also to a soft but triumphant outburst, a high plateau. They were pressed up against the heart of the sky. The stars burned low and low. Around them, the whole earth seemed in prospect at their feet. The moon burst through a mass of clouds, and she saw far off a great river running silver through the night. Happy? Aye, and he was happy too, and his happiness was one with hers. He was not even looking out the window while he whistled, but his eyes were fixed steadily, unchangingly, upon her face. It was then that they heard it. Dan Barry, come out. A hoarse, ringing cry, as of one who is shouting against a great wind. Dan Barry, come out. Dan Barry was on his feet and gliding to the wall, where he took down his belt from a nail and buckled it swiftly around him. And Kate ran to the window with the wolf dog snarling beside her, and saw standing in front of the house, his hat off, his black hair wildly tumbled, and 2 guns in his hands, Buck Daniels. Behind him the tall bay mare shook with her panting and glistening with the sweat of the long ride. She heard a scratching next, and saw the wolf dog rear up and paw at the door. Once through that door, he would be at the throat of the man outside, she knew. Nor he alone, for Dan Barry was coming swiftly across the room with that strange, padding step. He had no eye for her. He was smiling, and she would rather have seen him in a cursing fury than to see this smile. It curled the upper lip with something like a sneer, and she caught the white glint of his teeth, and the wolf dog snarled back over his shoulder to hurry his master. It was the crisis which she had known all day was coming, sooner or later. She had only prayed that it might be delayed for a little time. And confronting the danger was like stepping into the path of a runaway horse. Fear ruled her with an iron hand, and she swayed back against the wall and supported herself with an outstretched hand. What was there to be done? If she stepped in between him and his man, he would brush her aside from his path and out of his life forever. If he went on to his vengeance, he would no less be started on the path which led around the world away from her. The law would be the hound which pursued him and relentlessly nipped at his heels, an eternal terror and unrest. No thought of Buck Daniels, who had done so much for her. She cast his services out of her mind with the natural cruelty of women. Her whole thought was, selfishly, for the man before her and for herself. He was there, his hand upon the knob of the door, and then she remembered how the teeth of Black Bart had closed over her arm, and how they had not broken even the skin. In an instant she was pressed against the door before Dan Barry, her arms outstretched. He fell back the slightest bit before her, and then he came again and brushed her slowly, gently to one side, with an irresistible strength. She had to meet his eyes now. There was no help for it. And she saw there that swirl of yellow light, that insatiable hunger, and she knew fully and bitterly that she had failed. With the wolf dog, indeed, she had conquered, but the man escaped her. If time had been granted her, she would have won, she knew, but the hand of Buck Daniels, so long her ally, had destroyed her chances. It was his hand now which shook the knob of the door, and she turned with a sob of despair to face the new danger. In her wildest dreams she had never visioned Buck Daniels transformed like this. She knew that in his past, as one of those long riders who roamed the mountain desert, their hand against the hands of every man, Buck Daniels had been known and feared by the strongest. But all she had seen of Buck Daniels had been gentleness itself. Yet what faced her as the door flew wide was a nightmare thing, with haggard face and shadow-buried, glittering eyes, unshaven, unkempt hair, his shirt open at the throat, his great hands clenched for battle. The wolf dog, at that familiar sight, whined a low greeting, but with a glance at his master knew that there was a change. The old alliance was broken. So he bared his white teeth and changed his whine to a snarl of hate. Then a strange terror struck Kate Cumberland. She had never dreamed that she could fear for Dan Barry at the hands of any man, but now the desperate resolve which breathed from every line of Buck Daniels chilled her blood at the heart. She sprang back before Dan Barry. Facing him, she saw that demoniac glitter of yellow rising momentarily brighter in his eyes, and he was smiling. No execration or loud-voiced curse could have contained the distilled malignancy of that smile. All this she caught in a single glimpse. The next instant she had whirled and stood before Dan, shielding him with outspread arms and facing Buck Daniels. The latter thrust back into the holster the gun which he had drawn when he entered the room. "Stand away from him, Kate," he commanded, and his eyes went past her to dwell on the face of Barry. "Stand away from him. It's been coming for a long time, and now it's here. Barry, I'm taking no start on you. Stand away from the girl and pull your gun, and I'll pump you full of lead." The softest of soft voices murmured behind her, "I've been waiting for you, Buck, days and days and days. I ain't never been so glad to see anybody." And she felt Barry slip shadow-like to one side. She sprang in front of him again with a wild cry. "Buck," she begged, "don't shoot." Laughter, ringing and unhuman, filled the throat of Buck Daniels. "Is it him you're begging for?" he sneered at her. "Is it him you got your fears for? Ain't you got a word of pity for Buck Daniels that sneaked off like a whipped puppy? Bah, Dan Barry, the time has come. I've been leading the life of a hound dog for your sake, but it's ended. Pull your gun and get out from behind the skirts of that girl." As long as they faced each other with the challenge in their eyes, nothing on earth could avert the fight, she knew. But if she could delay them for one moment, she felt that swift-moving form behind her slipping away from behind her, and she could follow Barry's movements by the light in Daniel's eyes. "Buck," she cried, "for God's sake, for my sake, turn away from him and roll another cigarette." For she remembered the story, how Daniels had turned under the very nose of danger and done this insane thing in the saloon at Brownsville, and in her despair she could think of no other appeal. It was the very strangeness of it that gave it point. Buck Daniels turned on his heel. "It's the last kindness I do you, Dan," he said, with his broad back to them. "But before you die, you got to know why I'm killing you. I'm going to roll one cigarette and smoke it, and while I smoke it, I'm going to tell you the concentrated truth about your worthless self, and when I'm done smoking, I'm going to turn around and drop you where you stand. Do you hear?" "There's no need of waiting," answered the soft voice of Barry. "Talking don't mean much." But Kate Cumberland turned and faced him. He was fairly aquiver with eagerness, and the hate welled and blazed and flickered in his eyes. His face was pale, very pale, and it seemed to her that she could make out in the pallor the print of the fingers of Buck Daniels, and that blow those many days before, and she feared him as she had never feared him before, and yet she blocked his way still with the outspread arms. They could hear the crinkle of cigarette paper as Buck Daniels rolled his smoke. "No," said Buck, his voice suddenly altered to almost a casual moderation. "Talk don't mean nothing to you. Talk is human, and nothing human means nothing to you. But I got to tell you why you ought to die, Barry. I started out this morning hating the ground you walked on, but now I see there ain't no use to hate you. Is they any use in hating a mountain lion that kills calves? No, you don't hate it, but you get a gun and trail it and shoot it down, and that's the way with you." They heard the scratch of his match. "That's the way with you. I got my back to you right now, because if I looked you in the eye, I couldn't let you live no more than I could let a mountain lion live. I know you're faster with your gun than I am, and stronger than I am, and made to fight. But I know I'm going to kill you. You've done your work. You've left hell on all sides of you. It's your time to die. I know it. You've been lying like a snake in the rocks with your poison ready for any man that walks past you. Now your poison is about used up." He paused, and then, when he spoke again, there was a ring of exultation in his voice. "I tell you, Dan, I don't fear you. And I know that the bullet in this gun here on my hips is the one that's going to tear your heart out. I know it." Something like a sob came from the lips of Dan Barry. His hands moved out towards Buck Daniels as though he were plucking something from the empty air. "You've said enough," he said. "You've said plenty. Now turn around and fight." And Kate Cumberland stepped back out of the line of the two. She knew that in what followed she could not play the part of the protector or the delayer. Here they stood, hungry for battle, and there was no power in her weak hands to separate them. She stood far back and fumbled with her hands at the wall for support. She tried to close her eyes, but the fascination of the horror forced her to watch against her strongest will. And the chief part of that dreadful suspense lay in the even, calm voice of Buck Daniels as he went on. "I'll turn around and fight soon enough. But Kate asked me to smoke another cigarette. I know what she means. She wants me to leave you the way I done in the saloon that day. I ain't going to leave, Dan. But I'm glad she asked me to turn away, because it gives me a chance to tell you some things you got to know before you go west. Dan, you've been like a fire that burns every hand that touches you." He inhaled a long breath of smoke and blew it up towards the ceiling. "You've busted the heart of the friend that followed you. You've busted the heart of the girl that loves you." He paused again for another long inhalation, and Kate Cumberland, staring in fearful suspense, waiting for the instant when Buck should at last turn and when the shots should explode, saw the yellow glow was now somewhat misted in the eyes of Barry. He frowned as one bewildered. "Think of her, Dan," went on Buck Daniels. "Think of her wasting herself on a no-good hound dog like you, a no-good wild wolf. My God Almighty, she might have made some man happy, some man with a soul and a heart. But instead of that, God sent you like a blast across her, you with your damn soul of wind and your heart of stone. Think of it. When you see what you've been, Barry, I wonder you don't go out and take your own gun and blow off your head." "Buck," called Dan, "so help me God, if you don't turn your face to me, I'll shoot you through the back." "I knew," said the imperturbable Daniels, "that you'd come to that in the end. You used to fight like a man, but now you're following your instincts and you fight like a hunting wolf. Look at the brute that's slinking up to me there. That's what you are. You kill for the sake of killing like the beasts. If you was a man, could you treat me like you've done? Your damned cold heart and your yellow eyes and all would have burned up in the barn the other night, you and your wolf and your damned horse. Why didn't I let you burn? Because I was a fool, because I still thought there was something of the man in you. But I seen afterwards what you was, and I rode off to get out of your way, to keep your hands from getting red with my blood, and then you plan on following me, damn you, and following me. So that, Dan, is why I've come to put you out of the world, as I'm going to do now. Once you hated to give pain, and if you hurt people, it was because you couldn't help it. But now you live on torturing others. Barry, pull your gun." As he spoke, he whirled, the heavy revolver leaping into his hand. Still, Kate Cumberland could not close her eyes on the horror. She could not even cry out. She was frozen. But there was no report, no spurt of smoke, no form of a man stumbling blindly towards death. Dan Barry stood with one hand pressed over his eyes and the other dangled at his side, harmless, while he frowned in bewilderment at the floor. He said slowly at length, "Buck, I kind of think you're right. There ain't no use in me. I've been remembering, Buck, how you sent Kate to me when I was sick." There was a loud clatter. The revolver dropped from the hand of Buck Daniels. The musical voice of Dan Barry murmured again, "And I remember how you stood up to Jim Silent for my sake. Buck, what's come between us since them days? You hit me a while back, and since then I've been wanting your blood. But hearing you talk now, somehow I feel sort of lost and lonesome, like I've thrown something away that I valued most." Buck Daniels threw out his great arms, and his voice broke terribly. "Oh, God Almighty, Dan," he cried, "just take one step back to me, and I'll come all the way around the world to meet you." He stumbled across the floor and grasped at the hand of Barry, for a mist half blinded his eyes. "Dan," he pleaded, "ain't things as they once was? Do you forgive me?" "Why, Buck," murmured Dan Barry, in that same bewildered fashion, "seems like we was bunkies once." "Dan," muttered Buck Daniels, choking, "Dan." But he dared not trust his voice further, and turning, he fairly fled from the room. The dazed eyes of Dan Barry followed him. Then they moved until they encountered the face of Kate Cumberland. A shock, as if of surprise, widened the lids, and for a long moment they stared in silence, and then he began to walk very slowly, a step at a time, towards the girl. Now, as he faced her, she saw that there was no longer a hint of yellow in his eyes. But he stepped closer and closer. He was right before her, watching her with an expression of mute suffering that made her heart grow large. He said, more to himself than to her, "Seems like I've been away a long time." "A very long time," she whispered. He drew a great breath. "Is it true what Buck said about you?" "Oh, my dear, she cried. "Don't you see?" He started a little, and taking both her hands, he made her face the dull light from the windows. "Seems like you're kind of pale, Kate." "The color went out while I waited for you, Dan." "But there comes a touch of red like morning in your throat, and running up your cheeks." "Don't you see? It's because you've come back." He closed his eyes and murmured, "I remember we was close, closer than this. We were sitting here in this room by a fire, and then something called me out, and I followed it." "The wild geese, yes." "Wild geese," he repeated blankly, and then shook his head. "How could wild geese call me? But things happened. I was kept away. Sometimes I wanted to come back to you, but somehow I could never get started. Was it 10 years ago that I left?" "Months. Months longer than years." "What is it?" he asked. "I've been watching you, and waiting to find out what was different in you. Black Bart's seen something in you. I don't know what. Today I sort of guessed what it is. I can feel it now. It's something like a pain. It starts sort of in the stomach, Kate. It's like being away from a place where you want to be. Queer, ain't it? I ain't far from you. I got your hands in mine, but somehow you don't feel near. I want to walk a long ways closer, and the pain keeps growing." His voice fell away to a murmur, and now a deadly silence lay between them, and it seemed as if lights were varying upon their faces, so swift and subtle were the changes of expression. And they drew closer by imperceptible degrees. So his arms, fumbling, found their way about her, drew her closer, till her head dropped back and her face was close beneath his. "Was it true," he whispered, "what Buck said?" "There's nothing true, except that we're together." "But your eyes are brimful of tears." "The same pain you feel, Dan, the same loneliness and the hurt. But it's going now. I feel as I've been riding 3 days without more'n enough water to moisten my tongue every hour, and with the sand white hot, and my horse staggering, and the sun dropping closer and closer, till the mountains are touched with white fire. Then I come in the evening to a valley with cool shadows beginning to slip across the western side, and I stand in the shadow and feel the red-hot blood go smashing, smashing, smashing in my temples, and then a sound of running water somewhere up the hillside, running, cool, fresh, sparkling water, whispering over the rocks. Oh, God, that's what it means to me to stand here close to you, Kate. And it's like standing up in the morning on the top of a high hill and seeing the light jump up quick in the east, and there lies all the world at my feet, mile after mile of it. There's a river like silver away off yonder, and they's range after range walking off into the blue nothing. That's what it's like to stand here and look down into them blue eyes of yours, Kate, miles and miles into them, till I feel as if I can see your heart beneath. And they's the rose of the morning on your cheeks, and the breath of the morning stirring between your lips, and the light of the rising sun comes flaring in your eyes. And I own the world, I own the world. Two burning pieces of wood, that's you and me. And when I was away from you, the fire went down to a smolder. But now that we're close, a wind hits us. The flames come together, and rise and jump and twine together. Two pieces of burning wood, but only one flame. Do you feel it? Oh, Kate, our bodies is ashes and dust, and all that's worthwhile is that flame blowing up from us, setting the world on fire. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 35. Pale Annie. Even in Elkhead there were fires this day. In the Gilead saloon one might have thought that the liquid heat which the men had imbibed would serve in place of stoves, but the proprietor, Pale Annie, had an eye to form, and when the sky was gray he always lighted the stove. Pale Annie he was called, because his real name was Anderson Hawberry Sandringham. That name had been a great aid to him when he was an undertaker in Kansas City, but Anderson Hawberry Sandringham had fallen from the straight and narrow path of good undertakers some years before, and he had sought refuge in the mountain desert, where most things prosper except sheriffs and grass. He was fully 6 inches more than 6 feet in height, and his face was so long and pale that even Haw Haw Langley seemed cheerful beside the ex-undertaker. In Kansas City this had been much prized, for that single face could lend solemnity to any funeral. In Elkhead it was hardly less of an asset. People came out of curiosity to see Pale Annie behind the bar with his tall silk hat, which he could never bring himself to lay aside, among the cobwebs of the rafters. They came out of curiosity, and they remained to drink, which is a habit in the mountain desert. A traveling drummer or a patent medicine man had offered Pale Annie a handsome stake to simply go about with him and lend the sanction of his face to the talk of the drummer. But Pale Annie had discovered a veritable philosopher's stone in Elkhead, and he was literally turning whiskey into gold. This day was even more prosperous than usual for Pale Annie, for the gray weather and the chilly air made men glad of the warmth, both external and internal, which Pale Annie possessed in his bar-room. His dexterous hands were never for a moment still at the bar, either setting out drinks or making change, except when he walked out and threw a fresh feed into the fire, and stirred up the ruddy depths of the stove with a tall poker. It was so long, indeed, that it might have served even Pale Annie for a cane, and it was a plain, untapered bar of iron which the blacksmith had given him as the price of a drink on a day. He needed a large poker, however, for there was only the one stove in the entire big room, and it was a giant of its kind, as capacious as a hogshead. This day Pale Annie kept it red hot, so that the warmth might penetrate to the door on the one hand, and to the rear of the room where the tables and chairs were on the other. Since Pale Annie's crowd took little exercise except for bending their elbows now and again, and since the majority of them had been in the place fully half the day, by 10 in the evening sounds of hilarity began to rise from the saloon. Solemn-faced men, who had remained in their places for hour after hour, industriously putting away the red-eye, now showed symptoms of life. Some of them discovered hitherto hidden talents as singers, and they would rise from their places, remove their hats, open their bearded mouths, and burst into song. An antiquarian, who had washed gold in '49 and done nothing the rest of his life save grow a prodigious set of pure white whiskers, sprang from his place and did a hoedown that ravished the beholders. Thrice he was compelled to return to the floor, and in the end his performance was only stopped by an attack of sciatica. Two strong men carried him back to his chair and wept over him, and there was another drink all around. In this scene of universal joy there were two places of shadow. For at the rear end of the room, almost out of reach of the lantern light, sat Haw Haw Langley and Mac Strann. The more Haw Haw Langley drank, the more cadaverous grew his face, until in the end it was almost as solemn as that of Pale Annie himself. As for Mac Strann, he seldom drank at all. A full hour had just elapsed since either of them spoke, yet Haw Haw Langley said, as if in answer to a remark, "He's heard too much about you, Mac. He ain't no such fool as to come to Elkhead." "He ain't had time," answered the giant. "Ain't had time all these days?" "Wait till his dog gets well. He'll follow the dog to Elkhead." "Why, Mac, that trail's been washed out long ago. The wind the other day would have knocked out any trail less'n a big wagon." "It won't wash out the trail for that dog," said Mac Strann calmly. "Well," snarled Haw Haw, "I got to be getting back home pretty soon. I ain't rolling in coin the way you are, Mac." The other returned no answer, but let his eyes rove vacantly over the room, and since his head was turned the other way, Haw Haw Langley allowed a sneer to twist at his lips for a moment. "If I had the price," he said, "we'd have another drink." "I ain't drinking," answered the giant monotonously. "Then I'll go up and bum one off of Pale Annie. About time he come through with a little charity." So he unfurled his length and stalked through the crowd up to the bar. Here he leaned and confidentially whispered in the ear of Pale Annie, "Partner, I've been sprinkling dust for a long time in here, and there ain't been any reward. I'm dry, Annie." Pale Annie regarded him with grave disapproval. "My friend," he said solemnly, "liquor is the real root of all evil. For my part, I quench my thirst with water. There's a tub over there in the corner with a dipper handy. Don't mention it." "I didn't thank you," said Haw Haw Langley furiously. "Damn tightwad, say I." The long hand of Pale Annie curled affectionately around the neck of an empty bottle. "I didn't quite gather what you said," he remarked courteously, and leaned across the bar within striking distance. "I'll tell you later," remarked Haw Haw sullenly, and turned his shoulder to the bar. As he did so, two comparatively recent arrivals came up beside him. They were fresh from a couple of months of range finding, and they had been quenching a concentrated thirst by concentrated effort. Haw Haw Langley looked them over, sighed with relief, and then instantly produced Durham and the brown papers. He paused in the midst of rolling his cigarette and offered them to the nearest fellow. "Smoke?" he asked. Now a man of the mountain desert knows a great many things, but he does not know how to refuse. The proffer of a gift embarrasses him, but he knows no way of avoiding it. Also, he never rests easy until he has made some return. "Sure," said the man, and gathered in the tobacco and papers. "Thanks." He covertly dropped the cigarette which he had just lighted, and stepped on it. Then he rolled another from Haw Haw's materials. The while he kept an uneasy eye on his new companion. "Drinking?" he asked at length. "Not just now," said Haw Haw carelessly. "Oh, he's got room for another," protested the other, still more in earnest as he saw his chance of return disappearing. "All right, then," said Haw Haw, "just one more." And he poured a glass to the brim, waved it gracefully towards the others without spilling a drop, and downed it at a gulp. "Been in town long?" he asked. "Not long enough to find any action," answered the other. The eye of Haw Haw Langley brightened. He looked over the two carefully. The one had black hair and the other red, but they were obviously brothers, both tall, thick-shouldered, square-jawed, and pug-nosed. There was Irish blood in that twain. The fire in their eyes could have come from only one place on earth. And Haw Haw grinned and looked down the length of the room to where Mac Strann sat, a heavy, inert mass, his fleshy forehead puckered into a half-frown of animal wistfulness. "You ain't the only ones," he said to his companion at the bar. "They's a man in town who says they don't turn out any two men in this range that could give him action." "The hell," grunted he of the red hair, and he looked down to his blunt-knuckled hands. "'S matter of fact," continued Haw Haw easily, "he's right here now." He looked again towards Mac Strann and remembered once more the drink which Max might so easily have purchased for him. "It ain't Pale Annie, is it?" asked the black-haired man, casting a dubious glance up and down the vast frame of the undertaker. "Him? Not half," grinned Haw Haw. "It's a fat fella down to the end of the bar. I guess he's been drinking some, kind of off his nut." He indicated Mac Strann. "He looks to me," said the red-haired man, setting his jaw, "like a fellow that ain't too old to learn one more thing about the range in these parts." "He looks to me," chimed in the black-haired brother, "like a fellow that might be taught something right here in Pale Annie's barroom. Anyway, he's got room at his table for two more." So saying, the two swallowed their drinks and rumbled casually down the length of the room until they came to the table where Mac Strann sat. Haw Haw Langley followed at a discreet distance and came within earshot to hear the deep voice of Mac Strann rumbling, "Sorry, gents, but that chair's took." The black-haired man sank into the indicated chair. "You're right," he announced calmly. "Anyone could see with half an eye that you ain't a fool. It's took by me." And he grinned impudently in the face of Mac Strann. The latter, who had been sitting with slightly bent head, now raised it and looked the pair over carelessly. There was in his eye the same dumb curiosity which Haw Haw Langley had seen many a time in the eye of a bull, leader of the herd. The giant explained carefully, "I mean, they's a friend of mine that's been sitting in that chair." "If I ain't your friend," answered the black-haired brother instantly, "it ain't any fault of mine. Lay it up to yourself, partner." Mac Strann stretched out his hand on the surface of the table. He said, "I got an idea. You'd better get out of that chair." The other turned his head slowly on all sides and then looked Mac Strann full in the face. "Maybe there's something wrong with my eyes," he said, "but I don't see no reason." The little dialogue had lasted long enough to focus all eyes on the table at the end of the room, and therefore there were many witnesses to what followed. The arm of Mac Strann shot out, his hand fastened in the collar of the black-haired man's shirt, and the latter was raised from his seat and propelled to one side by a convulsive jerk. He probably would have been sent crashing into the bar had not his shirt failed under the strain. It ripped in two at the shoulders, and the seeker after action, naked to the waist, went reeling back to the middle of the room before he gained his balance. After him went Mac Strann with an agility astonishing in that squat, formless bulk. His long arms were outstretched and his fingers tensed, and in his face there was an uncanny joy. His lip had lifted in that peculiarly disheartening sneer. He was not a pace from him of the black hair when a yell of rage behind him and the other brother leaped through the air and landed on Mac Strann's back. He doubled up, slipped his arms behind him, and the next instant, without visible reason, the red-headed man hurtled through the air and smashed against the bar with a jolt that sent glassware shivering and singing. Then he relaxed on the floor, a twisted and foolish-looking mass. As for the seeker after action, he had at first reached after his revolver, but he changed his mind at the last instant, and instead picked up the great poker which leaned against the stove. It was a ponderous weapon, and he had to wield it in both hands. As he swung it around his head, there was a yell from men ducking out of the way, and Pale Annie curled his hand again around his favorite empty bottle. He had no good opportunity to demonstrate its efficiency, however. Mac Strann, crouching in a position from which he had catapulted the red-haired man, cast upwards a single glance at the other brother, and then he sprang in. The poker hissed through the air with the vigor of a strong man's arms behind it, and it would have cracked the head of Mac Strann like an empty eggshell if it had hit its mark. But it was heaved too high, and Mac Strann went in like a football player rushing the line, almost doubled up against the floor as he ran. His shoulder struck the other hardly higher than the knees, and they went down together, but doing so the head of Mac Strann's victim cracked against the floor, and he also was still. The exploit was greeted by a yell of applause, and then someone proposed a cheer, and it was given. It died off short on the lips of the applauders, however, for it was seen that Mac Strann was not yet done with his work, and he went about it in a manner which made men sober suddenly and exchange glances. First, the stranger dragged the two brothers together, laying one of them face down on the floor. The second he placed over the first, back to back. Next he picked up the long poker from the floor and slipped it under the head and down to the neck of the first man. The bystanders watched in utter silence, with a touch of horror coming now into their eyes. Now Mac Strann caught the ends of the iron and began to twist up on them. There was no result at first. He refreshed his hold and tried again. The sleeves of his shirt were seen to swell and then grow hard and taut with vast play of muscle beneath. His head bowed lower between his shoulders, and those shoulders trembled, and the muscles over them quivered like heat waves rising of a spring morning. There was a creaking now, and then the iron was seen to shiver, and then bend slowly. And once it was wrenched out of the horizontal, the motion was more and more rapid, until, when the giant was done with his labors, the ends of the iron overlapped around the necks of the two luckless brothers. Mac Strann stepped back and surveyed his work. The rest of the room was in silence, saving the red-headed man, who was coming back to consciousness and now withered and groaned feebly. He could not rise, that was manifest, for the thick band of iron tied his neck to the neck of his brother. Upon this scene Mac Strann gazed with a thoughtful air, and then stepped to the side of the room where stood a bucket of dirty water recently used for mopping behind the bar. This he caught up, returned, and dashed the black, greasy water over the pair. If it had been electricity, it could not have operated more effectively. The two awoke with one mind, and with a tremendous sputtering and cursing struggled to regain their feet. It was no easy thing, however, for when one stood up, the other slipped, and in his fall involved the brother. In the meantime, it made a jest exactly suited to the minds of Elkhead, and shrieks of hysterical laughter rewarded their struggles, until at length they sat solemnly back to back, easing the pressure of the iron as best they might with their hands. Assembled Elkhead reeled about the room, drunken with laughter, but Mac Strann went quietly back to his table and paid no attention to the scene. There is an end to all good things, however, and finally the two brothers concerted action together, rose, and then sidestepped towards the door, dripping the mop water at every step. Obviously they were bound for the blacksmith to lose their collar, and everyone in the saloon knew that the blacksmith was not in town. The old man who had done the hoedown hobbled to the end of the bar-room, and before the table of Mac Strann made a speech to the effect that Elkhead had everything it needed except laughter, that Mac Strann had come to their assistance in that respect, and that if he, the old man, had the power, he would pension such an efficient jester and keep him permanently in the town. To all of this Mac Strann paid not the slightest heed, but with his fleshy brow puckered considered the infinite distance. Even the drink which Pale Annie, grateful for the averted riot, placed on the table before him, Mac Strann allowed to stand untasted, and it was private stock. It was at this time that Haw Haw Langley made his way back to the table and occupied the contested seat. "That was a bum play," he said solemnly to Mac Strann. "When Barry hears about what you done here to two men, do you think that he'll ever hit your trail?" The other started. "I never thought about it," he murmured, his thick lips as always framing speech with difficulty. "Do you suppose I ought to go back to the Cumberland place for him?" A yell rose at the farther end of the room. "A wolf! Hey, shoot the damn wolf!" "You fool!" cried another. "He ain't skinny enough to be a wolf. Besides, who ever heard of a tame wolf coming into a bar-room?" Nevertheless, many a gun was held in readiness, and the men, even the most drunken, fell back to one side and allowed a free passage for the animal. It seemed indeed to be a wolf, and a giant of its kind, and it slunk now with soundless step through the silence of the bar-room, glancing neither to right nor to left, until it came before the table of Mac Strann. There it halted and slunk back a little, the upper lip lifted away from the long fangs. Its eyes glittered upon the face of the giant, and then it swung about and slipped out of the bar-room as it had come, in utter silence. In the utter silence, Mac Strann leaned across the table to Haw Haw Langley. "He's come alone this time," he said, "but next time he'll bring his master with him. We'll wait." The Adam's apple rose and fell in the throat of Haw Haw. "We'll wait," he nodded, and he burst into the harsh, unhuman laughter which had given him his name. End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 36. The Discovery of Life. This is the letter which Swinnerton Loughbourne received over the signature of Dr. Randall Byron. It was such a strange letter that between paragraphs Swinnerton Loughbourne paced up and down his Gramercy Park studio and stared, baffled, at the heights of the Metropolitan Tower. Dear Swinnerton, I'll be with you in good old Manhattan about as soon as you get this letter. I am sending this ahead because I want you to do me a favor. If I have to go back to those bare, blank rooms of mine, with the smell of chemicals drifting in from the laboratory, I'll get drunk. That's all. Here Swinnerton Loughbourne lowered the letter to his knees and grasped his head in both hands. Next he turned to the end of the letter and made sure that the signature was Randall Byron. He stared again at the handwriting. It was not the usual script of the young doctor. It was bolder, freer, and twice as large as usual. There was a total lack of regard for the amount of stationery consumed. Shaking his head in bewilderment, Swinnerton Loughbourne shook his fine gray head and read on. What I want you to do is to stir about and find me a new apartment. Mind you, I don't want the loft of some infernal arcade building in the 60s. Get me a place somewhere between 30th and 58th. 2 bedrooms. I want a place to put some of the boys when they drop around my way. And at least 1 servant's room. Also, at least 1 large room where I can stir about and wave my arms without hitting the chandelier. Are you with me? Here Swinnerton Loughbourne seized his head between both hands again and groaned. Dementia, plain and simple dementia, and at his age, poor boy. He continued, Find an interior decorator. Not one of those fuzzy-haired women in pants, but a he-man who knows what a he-man needs. Tell him, I want that place furnished regardless of expense. I want some deep chairs that will hit me under the knees. I want some pictures on the wall, but nothing out of the 18th century, no impressionistic landscapes, no girls dolled up in fluffy stuff. I want some pictures I can enjoy, even if my maiden aunt can't. There you are. Tell him to go ahead on those lines. In a word, Swinnerton, old top, I want to live. For about 30 years I've thought, and now I know that there's nothing in it. All the thinking in the world won't make 1 more blade of grass grow, put 1 extra pound on the ribs of a longhorn, and in a word, thinking is the bunk, pure and simple. At this point Swinnerton Loughbourne staggered to the window, threw it open, and leaned out into the cold night. After a time he had strength enough to return to his chair and read through the rest of the epistle without interruption. You wonder how I've reached this new viewpoint? Simply by seeing some concentrated life here at the Cumberland Ranch. My theories are blasted and knocked in the head, praise God, and I've brushed a million cobwebs out of my brain. Chemistry? Rot. There's another sort of chemistry that works on the inside of a man. That's what I want to study. There are 3 great preliminary essentials to the study. First, how to box with a man. Second, how to talk with a girl. Third, how to drink old wine. Try the 3, Swinnerton. They aren't half bad. At first, they may give you a sore jaw, an aching heart, and a spinning head, but in the end, they teach you how to keep your feet and fight. This is how my eyes were opened. When I came out to this ranch, it was hard for me to ride a horse. So I've been studying how it should be done. Among other things, you should keep your toes turned in, you know, and there are many other things to learn. When I had mastered them one by one, I went out the other day and asked to have a horse saddled. It was done, and a lantern-jawed cowpuncher brought out a piebald gelding with long ears and sleepy eyes. Not a lovely beast, but a mild one. So I went into the saddle according to theory, with some slight hesitation here and there, planted my feet in the stirrups, and told the lantern-jawed fellow to turn loose the head of the piebald. This was done. I shook the reins. The horse did not move. I called to the brute by name. One ear wagged back to listen to me. I kicked the beast in the ribs. Unfortunately, I had forgotten that long spurs were on my heels. The horse was instantly aware of that fact, however. He leaped into a full gallop, a very jolty process. Then he stopped, but I kept on going. A fence was in the way, so I was halted. Afterwards, the lantern-jawed man picked me up and offered to carry me back to the house, or at least get a wheelbarrow for me. I refused with some dignity. I remarked that I preferred walking, really, and so I started out across the hills and away from the house. My head was sore, so were my shoulders where I hit the fence. I began to think of the joy of facing that horse again, armed with a club. It was evening, after supper, you see, and the light of the moon was already brighter than the sunlight. And by the time I had crossed the first range of hills, it was quite dark. As I walked, I brooded upon many things. There were enough to disturb me. There was old Joe Cumberland at death's door, and beyond the reach of my knowledge, and he had been taken away from death by the wild man, Dan Barry. There was the girl with the bright hair, Kate Cumberland. In education, nothing. In brain, nothing. In experience, nothing. And yet I was attracted. But she was not attracted in the least until along came the wild man again, and then she fell into his arms, actually fought for him. Why? I could not tell. My name and the things I have done, and even my money, meant nothing to her. But when he came, it was only a glance, a word, a smile, and she was in his arms. I felt like Caligula. I wished the world had only one neck, and I an axe. But why should I have felt depressed because of failures in the eyes of these silly yokels? Not one of them could read the simplest chemical formula. All very absurd, you will agree, and you may get some inkling as to my state of mind while I walked over those same dark hills. I seemed a part of that darkness. I looked up to the stars. They were merely like the pages of a book. I named them offhand, one after the other, and thought of their characteristics, their distances, their composition, and meditated on the marvels the spectrum has made known to us. But no sooner did such a train of thought start in my brain than I again recurred to the girl, Kate Cumberland, and all I was aware of was a pain at heart, something like homesickness. Very strange. She and the man are together constantly. The other day I was in Joseph Cumberland's room, and we heard whistling outside. The face of the old man lighted. "They are together again," he said. "How do you guess at that?" I asked. "By the sound of his whistling," he answered. "For he whistles, as if he expected an answer, as if he were talking with someone. And by the Lord, the old man was right. It would never have occurred to me. Now as I started down the farther slope of a hill, a whistling sound ran upon me through the wind, and looking back I saw a horseman galloping with great swiftness along the line of the crest, very plainly outlined by the sky, and by something of the smoothness in the running of the horse I knew that it was Barry and his black stallion. But the whistling, the music, dear God, man, have you read of the pipes of Pan? That night I heard them, and it made a riot in my heart. He was gone suddenly, and the whistling went out like a light, but something had happened inside me. The first beginning of this process of internal change. The ground no longer seemed so dark. There were earth smells, very friendly. I heard some little creature chirruping contentedly to itself. Something hummed, a grasshopper perhaps. And then I looked up to the stars. There was not a name I could think of. I forgot them all, and for the first time I was contented to look at them and wonder at their beauty without an attempt at analysis or labeling. If I say that I went back to the ranch house with my feet on the ground and my heart up there among the stars, will you understand? I found the girl sewing in front of the fire in the living room. Simply looked up to me with a smile and a certain dimness about the eyes. Well, my breath stopped. "Kate," said I am going away tomorrow morning." "And leave Dad?" said she. "To tell you the truth," I answered, "there is nothing I can do for him. There has never been anything I could do for him." "I am sorry," said she, and lifted up her eyes to me. Now, I had begun by being stiff with her, but the ringing of that whistling, pipes of Pan, you know, was in my ears. I took a chair beside her. Something overflowed in my heart. For the first time in whole days I could look on her beauty without pain. "Do you know why I'm going?" I asked. She waited. "Because," said I, and smiled right into her face, "I love you, Kate, most infernally, and I know perfectly well that I will get never the devil a bit of good out of it." She peered at me. "You aren't jesting," says she. "No, you're serious." "I'm very sorry, Dr. Byron." "And I answered, am glad. I wouldn't change it for the world. For once in my life, tonight, I have forgotten myself. No, I won't go away and nurse a broken heart. But I'll think of you as a man should think of something bright and above him. You'll keep my heart warm, Kate, till I'm a very old man. Because of you, I'll be able to love some other girl, and a fine one, by the Lord." Something in the nature of an outburst, huh? But it was the music which had done it. All the time it rang and echoed through my ears. My words were only an echo of it. I was in tune with the universe. I was living for the first time. The girl dropped her sewing, tossed it aside. She came over to me and took my hands in a way that would have warmed even the icicles of your heart, Swinnerton. "Doctor," says she, "I know that you are going to be very happy." "Happiness," said I, "is a trick like riding a horse, and I think that I've learned the trick. I've caught it from you and from Barry." At that she let go my hands and stepped back. The very devil is in these women, Swinnerton. You can never place them for a minute at a time. "I'm trying to learn myself," she said, and there was a shadow of wistfulness in her eyes. In another moment I should have made a complete fool of myself, but I remembered in time and got out of the room. Tomorrow I start back for the old world, but I warn you beforehand, my dear fellow, that I'm bringing something of the new world with me. What has it all brought to me? I am sad one day and gay the next, but at least I know that thinking is not life, and now I'm ready to fight. Randall Byron. End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand, Chapter 37, The Piebald. The morning of the doctor's departure witnessed quite a ceremony at the Cumberland ranch, for old Joe Cumberland insisted that he be brought down from his room to his old place in the living room. When he attempted to rise from his bed, however, he found that he could not stand, and big Buck Daniels lifted the old man like a child and carried him down the stairs. Once ensconced on the sofa in the living room, Joe Cumberland beckoned his daughter close to him, and whispered with a smile as she leaned over, "Here's what comes of pretending, Kate. I've been pretending to be too sick to walk, and now I can't walk, and if I'd pretended to be well, I'd be riding Satan right now." He looked about him. "Where's Dan?" he asked. "Upstairs, getting ready for the trip." "Trip?" "He's riding with Dr. Byron to town, and he'll bring back Dr. Byron's horse." The old man grew instantly anxious. "They's a lot of things can happen on a long trip like that, Kate." She nodded gravely. "But we have to try him," she said. "We can't keep him here at the ranch all the time. And if he really cares, Dad, he'll come back." "And you let him go of your own free will?" asked Joe Cumberland wonderingly. "I asked him to go," she answered quietly, but some of the color left her face. "Of course it's going to come out all right," nodded the father. "I asked him when he'd be back, and he said he would be here by dark tomorrow night." The old man sighed with relief. "He don't never slip up on promises," he said. "But oh, lass, I'll be glad when he's back again. Buck, how'd you and Dan come along together?" "We don't come," answered Buck gloomily. "I tried to shake hands with him yesterday and call it quits, but he wouldn't touch me. He just leaned back and smiled at me and hated me with his eyes. That way he has. He don't even look at me except when he has to, and when he does I feel like someone was sneaking up behind me with a knife ready. And he ain't said 10 words to me since I come back." He paused and considered Kate with the same dark, lowering glance. "Tomorrow I leave." "You'll think better of that," nodded Joe Cumberland. "Here's the doctor now." He came in with Dan Barry behind him. A changed man was the doctor. He was a good 2 inches taller because he stood so much more erect, and there was a little spring in his step which gave aspiration and spirit to his carriage. He bade them good-bye one by one, and by Joe Cumberland he sat down for an instant and wished him luck. The old ranchman drew the other down closer. "They's no luck for me," he whispered, "but don't tell none of 'em. I'm about to take a longer trip than you'll ride today, but first I'll see 'em settle down here. Dan, quiet, and both of 'em happy. So long, Doc. Thanks for taking care of me. But this here is something that can't be beat no way. Too many years break the back of any man, Doc. Luck to you." "If you'll step to the door," said the doctor, smiling upon the rest, "you'll have some fun to watch. I'm going to ride on the piebald." "Him that throwed ye yesterday?" grinned Buck Daniels. "The same," said the doctor. "I think I can come to a gentleman's understanding with him. A gentleman, from the piebald's point of view, is one who is never unintentionally rude. He may change his mind this morning, or he may break my back. One of the two is sure to happen." In front of the house Dan Barry already sat on Satan, with Black Bart sitting nearby watching the face of his master. And beside them the lantern-jawed cowpuncher held the bridle of the piebald mustang. Never in the world was there a lazier-appearing beast. His lower lip hung pendulous a full inch and a half below the upper. His eyes were rolled so that hardly more than the whites showed. He seemed to stand asleep, dreaming of some nirvana for equine souls, and the only signs of life were the long ears which wobbled occasionally back and forth. When the doctor mounted, the piebald limited all signs of interest to opening one eye. The doctor clucked. The piebald switched his tail. Satan, at a word from Dan Barry, moved gracefully into a soft trot away from the house. The doctor slapped his mount on the neck. An ear flicked back and forth. The doctor stretched out both legs, and then he dug both spurs deep into the flanks of the mustang. It was a perfectly successful maneuver. The back of the piebald changed from an ugly humped line to a decidedly sharp parabola, and the horse left the ground with all 4 feet. He hit it again, almost in the identical hoof marks, and with all legs stiff. The doctor sagged drunkenly in the saddle, and his head first swung far back and then snapped over so that the chin banged against his chest. Nevertheless, he clung to the saddle with both hands and stayed in his seat. The piebald swung his head around sufficiently to make sure of the surprising fact, and then he commenced to buck in earnest. It was a lovely exhibition. He bucked with his head up and his head between his knees. He bucked in a circle and in a straight line, and then mixed both styles for variety. He made little spurts at full speed, leaped into the air, and came down stiff-legged at the end of the run, his head between his braced forefeet, and then he whirled as if on a peg, and darted back the other way. He bucked criss-cross, jumping from side to side, and he interspersed this with samples of all his other kinds of bucking thrown in. That the doctor stuck on the saddle was a miracle beyond belief. Of course, he pulled leather shamelessly throughout the contest, but riding straight up is a good deal of a myth. Fancy riding is reserved for circus men. The mountain desert is a place where men stick close to utility and let style go hang. And the doctor stuck in the saddle. He had set his teeth, and he was a seasick greenish white. His hat was a jog over one ear. His shirt tails flew out behind, and still he remained to battle. Aye, for he ceased the passive clinging to the saddle. He gathered up the long quirt which had hitherto dangled idly from his wrist, and at the very moment when the piebald had let out another notch in his feats, the doctor, holding on desperately with one hand, and with the other brandished the quirt around his head and brought it down with a crack along the flanks of the piebald. The effect was a little short of a miracle. The mustang snorted and leaped once into the air, but he forgot to come down stiff-legged, and then instantly he broke into a little, soft dog trot and followed humbly in the trail of the black stallion. The laughter and cheers from the house were the sweetest of music in the ears of Dr. Randall Byron. The most sounding sentences of praise from the lips of the most learned of professors after this would be the most shabby of anticlimaxes. He waved his arm back to a group standing in front of the house. Buck Daniels, Kate, the lantern-jawed cowboy, and Wung Lu waving his kitchen apron. In another moment he was beside the rider of the stallion, and the man was whistling one of those melodies which defied repetition. It simply ran on, smoothly sweeping through transition after transition, soaring and falling in the most effortless manner. Now it paused, now it began again. It was never loud, but it carried like the music of a bird on wing, blown by the wind. There was about it also something which escaped from the personal. He began to forget that it was a man who whistled, and such a man. He began to look about to the hills and the sky and the rocks, for these, it might be said, were set to music. They, too, had the sweep of line and the broken rhythms, the sense of spaciousness, the far horizons. That day was a climax of the unusual weather. For a long time the sky had been periodically blanketed with thick mists, but today the wind had freshened, and it tore the mists into 1,000 mighty fragments. There was never blue sky in sight, only far up a diminishing and lighter gray to testify that above it the yellow sun might be shining. But all the lower heavens were asweep with vast cloud masses, irregular, huge, hurling across the sky. They hung so low that one could follow the speed of their motion and almost gauge it by miles per hour. And in the distance They seemed to brush the tops of the hills. Seeing this, the doctor remembered what he had heard of rain in this region. It would come, they said, in sheets and masses, literal waterfalls. Dry arroyos suddenly filled and became swift torrent, rolling big boulders down their courses. There were tales of men fording rivers who were suddenly overwhelmed by terrific walls of water which rushed down from the higher mountains in masses 4 and 8 feet high. In coming, they made a thundering among the hills, and they plucked up full-grown trees like twigs thrust into wet mud. Indeed, that was the sort of rain one would expect in such a country, so whipped and naked of life. Even the reviving rain was sent in the form of a scourge, and that which should make the grass grow might tear it up by the roots. That was a time of change and of portent, and a day well fitted to the mood of Randall Bryan. He also had altered, and there was about to break upon him the rain of life, and whether it would destroy him or make him live, and richly, he could not guess. But he was naked to the skies of chance, naked as this landscape. Far past the midday, they reached the streets of Elkhead and stopped at the hotel. As the doctor swung down from his saddle, cramped and sore from the long ride, thunder rattled over the distant hills, and a patter of rain splashed in the dust and sent up a pungent odor to his nostrils. It was like the voice of the earth proclaiming its thirst. And a blast of wind leaped down the street and lifted the brim of Barry's hat and set the bandana at his throat fluttering. He looked away into the teeth of the wind and smiled. There was something so curious about him at that instant that Randall Bryan wanted to ask him into the hotel, wanted to have him knee to knee for a long talk. But he remembered the old poem, "The seashell needs the waves of the sea, the bird will not sing in the cage," and the yellow light in the eyes of Barry, phosphorescent almost, a thing that might be nearly seen by night, that surely would not shine under any roof. It was the wind which made him smile. These things he understood without fear. So he said good-bye, and the rider waved carelessly and took the reins of the piebald and turned the stallion back. He noted the cat-like grace of the horse in moving, as if his muscles were steel springs, and he noted also that the long ride had scarcely stained the glossy hide with sweat, while the piebald reeked with the labor. Randall Bryan drew thoughtfully back onto the porch of the hotel and followed the rider with his eyes. In a moment a great cloud of dust poured down the street, covered the rider, and when it was gone he had passed around a corner and out of the life of the doctor. End of chapter 37. Chapter 38 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 38. The Challenge. All this time Black Bart had trotted contentedly ahead of Satan, never having to glance back, but apparently knowing the intended direction, save that when Dan Barry turned to the road leading out of the little town, the wolf dog had turned in an opposite direction. The rider turned in the saddle and sent a sharp whistle towards the animal, but he was answered by a short howl of woe that made him check Satan and swing around. Black Bart stood in the center of the street facing in the opposite direction, and he looked back over his shoulder towards his master. There was apparently a perfect understanding between them, and the master first glanced up and made sure of the position of the sun and the length of time he might allow for the trip home before he decided to follow the whim of the wolf dog. Then he turned Satan and cantered, with the piebald trailing, back towards Black Bart. At this the wolf dog began to trot down the street, turned the next corner, and drew up at the door of a rambling building above which hung a dirty, cracked sign, "Gilead Saloon," and underneath, in smaller letters, was painted the legend, "Here's where you get it."
Black Bart strolled up to the swinging doors of the Emporium, and then turned to look back at his master. Clearly he wished Dan to enter the place, but the rider shook his head, and would certainly have ridden on had not, at that moment, the rain, which had hitherto fallen only in rattling bursts, now burst over the roofs of the town with a loud roaring as of wind through a forest. It was possible that the shower might soon pass over, so Dan rode under the long shelter which stretched in front of the saloon, dismounted, and entered behind Black Bart. It was occupied by a scattering of people, for the busy time of the day had not yet commenced, and Pale Annie was merely idling behind the bar, working at half speed, as it were. To this group Black Bart paid not the slightest heed, but glided smoothly down the center of the long room until he approached the tables at the end, where in a corner sat a squat, thick-chested man, and opposite him the most cadaverously lean fellow that Whistling Dan had ever seen. Before these two Black Bart paused, and then cast a glance over his shoulder towards the master. Whistling Dan frowned in wonder. He knew neither of the pair, but Black Bart apparently did. He slouched a pace closer, crouched, and bared his fangs with a tremendous snarl. At this the lean man left his chair and sprang back to a distance. Terror convulsed his face, but his eyes glittered with a fascinated interest, and he glanced first at his companion and then at the great wolf-dog, as if he were making a comparison between them. It was the broad-shouldered man who first spoke. "Partner," he said in a thick voice, in which the articulation was almost lost, "maybe you'd better take your dog out before he gets hurt. He don't like me, and I don't like him none too much." "Bart," called Dan Barry. But Black Bart gave no heed. There had been a slight flexing of his muscles as he crouched, and now he leaped, a black bolt of fighting weight, squarely in the face of the giant. He was met and checked midway in his spring, for the two long arms darted out, two great hands fastened in the throat of the beast, and Black Bart fell back upon the floor, with Mac Strann following, his grip never broken by the fall. A scurry of many feet running towards the scene, a shouting of 20 voices around him, but all that Whistling Dan saw were the fangs of Bart as they gnashed fruitlessly at the wrists of Mac Strann, and then the great red tongue lolling out and the eyes bulging from their sockets. All he heard was the snarling of the wolf and the peculiar whine of rage which came from the throat of the man-beast fighting the wolf. Then he acted. His hands darted between the thick forearms of Mac Strann. His elbows jerked out and snapped the grip. Next he dragged Black Bart away from the danger. The wolf was instantly on his feet and lunging again, but a sharp "heel" from Dan checked him mid-leap. He came to a shuddering halt behind the legs of his master. Whistling Dan slipped a little closer to the giant. "I should have knowed you before," he said in a voice which carried only to the ears of Strann. "You're the brother of Jerry Strann, and there's a reason why Bart hates you, partner." The thick upper lip of Strann lifted slightly as he spoke. "Him or you and your wolf-dog together, or one by one, it don't make no difference to me. I've come for you, Barry." The other straightened a little, and his eyes traveled slowly up and down the form of Strann. "I've been hungerin' to meet a man like you," he said. "Hungerin', partner. North of town, they's the old McDuffie place, all in ruins, and nobody ever near it. I'll be there in an hour, my friend." "I'll be waiting for you there," nodded Mac Strann, and so saying he turned back to his table as if he had been interrupted by nothing more than a casual greeting. Still Dan Barry remained a moment with his eyes on the face of Mac Strann, and when he turned and walked with his light, soundless step down the length of the silent bar-room, the wolf-dog slunk at his heels, ever and anon swinging his head over his shoulder and glancing back at the giant at the end of the room. As the door closed on man and dog, the saloon broke once more into murmur, and then into an excited clamoring. Pale Annie stepped from behind the bar and leaned upon the table beside Mac Strann. Even while leaning in this manner, the bartender was as tall as the average man. He waved back the others with a gesture of his tremendous arm. Then he reached out and took the hand of Mac Strann in his clammy fingers. "My friend," said the ex-undertaker in his careful manner, "I seen a man once, California, a husky 2-year-old, which nobody said could be done. And I've seen some other things, but I've never seen anything to touch the way you handled Black Bart. Do you know anything about that dog?" Mac Strann shook his ponderous head, and his dull eyes considered Pale Annie with an expression of almost living curiosity. "Black Bart has a record behind him that an old-time gunman would have heard with envy. There are dead men in the record of that dog, sir." All this he had spoken in a comparatively loud voice, but now, noting that the others had heeded his gesture and had made back towards the bar to drink on the strength of that strange fight between man and beast, the bartender approached his lips close to the ear of the giant. He said in a rapid murmur, "I watched you talking with Dan Barry, and I saw Barry's face when he went out. You and he are to meet somewhere again today. My friend, don't throw yourself away." Here Mac Strann stared down at his mighty hand, a significant answer, but Pale Annie went on swiftly. "Yes, you're strong, but strength won't save you from Dan Barry. We know him here in Elkhead. Do you know that if he had pulled his gun and shot you down right here where you sit, that he could have walked out of this room without a hand raised to stop him? Yes, sir. And why? Because we know his record, and I'd rather go against a wolf with my bare hands as you did than stand up against Dan Barry with guns. I could tell you how he fought Jim Silent's gang 1-6. I could tell you a lot of other things. My friend, I will tell you about 'em if you'll listen." But Mac Strann considered the speaker with his dull eyes. "I was never much on talking," he observed mildly. "I don't understand talking very well." Pale Annie started to speak again, but checked himself, stared earnestly at Mac Strann, and then hurried back behind the bar. His face was even graver than usual, but business was business with Pale Annie, and all men have to die in their time. Haw Haw Langley took the place which Pale Annie had left vacant opposite Mac Strann. He cast a frightened glance upward, where the rain roared steadily on the roof of the building. Then his eyes fluttered back until they rested on the face of his companion. He had to moisten his thin lips before he could speak, and even then it was a convulsive effort, like a man swallowing too large a morsel. "Well," said Haw Haw, "is it fixed?" "It's fixed," said Mac Strann. "Maybe you'd get the hosses, Haw Haw, if you're comin' with me." A dark shadow swept over the face of Haw Haw Langley. "You're going to beat it?" he sneered. "After you come all this way, you're going to run away from Barry, and him not half your size?" "I'm going out to meet him," answered Mac Strann. Haw Haw Langley started up as if he feared Mac Strann would change his mind if there were any delay. His long fingers twisted together as if to bring the blood into circulation about the purple knuckles. "I'll have the horses right around to the front," he said, "by the time you got your slicker on, Mac. I'll have 'em around in front." And then he stalked swiftly from the room. End of chapter 38. Chapter 39 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 39. The Storm. When they rode out of the town, the wet sand squashed under the feet of their horses and splashed up on their riding boots and their slickers. It even spotted their faces here and there, and a light brown spray darted out to right and left of the falling hoofs. For all the streets of Elkhead were running shallow rivers, with dark, swift currents, and when they left the little town, the landscape was shut out by the falling torrents. It made a strange and shifting panorama, for the rain varied in its density now and again, and as it changed, hills which had been quite blotted out leaped close upon them, like living things, and then sprang back again into the mist. So heavy was that tropical fall of water that the horses were bothered by the beating of the big drops, and shook their heads and stamped fretfully under the ceaseless bombardment. Indeed, when one stretched out his hand, the drops stung him, as if with lashes of tiny whips. There was no wind, no thunder, no flash of lightning, only the tremendous downpour which blended earth and sky in a drab, swift river. The air was filled with parallel lines, as in some pencil drawings, not like ordinary rain, but as if the sky had changed into a vast watering spout, and was sending down a continuous flood from a myriad holes. It was hard to look up through the terrific downpour, for it blinded one and whipped the face and made one breathless. But now and again a puff of the rare wind would lift the sodden brim of the sombrero, and then one caught a glimpse of the low-hanging clouds, with the nearest whiff of black mist dragging across the top of a hill. Without noticeable currents of wind, the mass of clouds was shifting slowly, with a sort of rolling motion, across the sky, and the weight of the rain forced the two to bend their heads and stare down to where the face of the earth was alive with the gliding brown waters, whose surface was thrashed into a continual foam. To speak to each other through the uproar, they had to cup their hands about their lips and shout. Then again the rainfall around them fell away to a drizzling mist, and the beating of the downpour sounded far away, and they were surrounded by distant walls of noise. So they came to the McDuffie place. It was a helpless ruin, long abandoned. Not an iota of the roof remained. The sheds for the horses had dropped to the earth, but the walls of the house still remained standing, in part, with the empty windows looking out with a mocking promise of the shelter which was not within. Upon this hollow shack the rain beat with redoubled fury, and even before they could make out the place through the blankets of rain, they heard the hollow drumming, for there were times, oddly enough, when any sound would carry a great distance through the crashing of the rain. A wind now sprung up, and at once veered the rain from its perpendicular fall. It slashed them in the face under the drooping brims of their sombreros, so they drew into the shelter of the highest part of the standing wall. Still, some of the rain struck them, but the major part of it was shunted over their heads. Moreover, the wall acted as a sort of sounding board, catching up every odd noise from the storm-beaten plain beyond. They could speak to each other now, without effort. "Do you think," asked Haw Haw Langley, pressing his reeking horse a little closer to Mac Strann, "that he'll come out after us in a rain like this?" But simple-minded Mac Strann lifted his head and peered through the thick curtains of rain. "Do you think," he parried, "that Jerry could maybe look through all this and see what I'm doing today?" It made Haw Haw Langley grin, but peering more closely and observing that there was no mockery in the face of the giant, he wiped out his grin with a scrubbing motion of his wet hand and peered closely into the face of his companion. "There ain't no doubt of it," he answered reassuringly. "He'll know what you do, Mac. What was it that Pale Annie said to you?" "Wanted me not to meet Barry. Said that Barry had once cleaned up a gang of 6. And here we are, only 2. "You ain't going to fight," warned Mac Strann sharply. "It'll be man to man, Haw Haw." "But he might not notice that," cried Haw Haw, and he caressed his scrawny neck as though he already felt fingers closing about his windpipe. "Him being used to fight crowds, Mac. Did you think of that?" "I never asked you to come," responded Mac Strann. "Mac," cried Haw Haw in a sudden alarm, "suppose you wasn't to win? Suppose you wasn't able to keep him away from me?" The numb lips of Mac Strann sprawled into an ugly smile, but he made no other answer. "You don't think you'll lose," hurried on Haw Haw. "But neither did them 6 that Pale Annie was talking about, most like. But they did. They lost. But if you lose, what'll happen to me?" "There ain't no call for you to stay here," said Mac Strann with utter indifference. Haw Haw answered quickly. "I wouldn't go. I wouldn't miss it for nothing. Ain't I come all this way to see it? I mean to help. Would I fall down on you now, Mac? No, I wouldn't." And twisting those bony fingers together, he burst once more into that rattling, unhuman laughter which all the three bees knew so well, and dreaded as the dying dread the sight of the circling buzzard above. "Stop laughing!" cried Mac Strann with sudden anger. "Damn you, stop laughing!" The other peered upon Mac Strann with incredulous delight, his broad mouth gaping to that thirsting grin of enjoyment. "You ain't getting nervous, Mac?" he queried, and thrust his face closer to make sure. "You ain't bothered, Mac? You ain't doubting how this'll turn out?" There was no answer, and so he replied to himself. "I know what done it to you. I seen it myself. It was that yeller light in his eyes, Mac. My God, it come up there out of nothing, and it wasn't a light that ought to come into no man's eyes. It was like I woke up at night with a cold weight on my chest and found two snake's eyes glittering close to my face. Makes me shivery like, just to think of it now. Do you notice that, Mac?" "I'm tired of talking," said Mac Strann hoarsely. "Damn tired." And so saying, he swung his great head slowly around and glared at Haw Haw. The latter shrank away with an undulatory motion in his saddle, and when the head of Mac Strann turned away again, the broad mouth began gibbering. "It's getting him like it done me. He's scared, 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 even Mac Strann." He broke off, for Mac Strann had jerked up his head and said in a strangely muffled voice, "What was that?" The bullet head of Haw Haw Langley leaned to one side, and his glittering eyes rolled up while he listened. "Nothing," he said. "I don't hear nothing." "Listen again," cried Mac Strann in that same cautious voice, as of one whispering in the night in the house of the enemy. "It's like a voice in the wind. It comes down the wind. Do you hear now? Now? Now?" It was indeed the faintest of faint sounds when Haw Haw caught it. It was in the roar of the rain, as indistinct as some distant light on the horizon, which may come from either a rising star or from the window of a house. But it had a peculiar quality of its own, even as the house light would be tinged with yellow when the stars are cold and white. A small and distant sound, and yet it cut through the crashing of the storm more and more clearly. Someone rode through the rain whistling. "It's him," gasped Haw Haw Langley. "My God Almighty, Mac, he's whistling. It ain't possible." He reined his horse closer to the wall, listening with mouth agape. He shrilled suddenly, "What if he should hit us both, seeing us together? There ain't no heart in a fellow that can whistle in a storm like this." But Mac Strann had lowered his head bulldog-like, and now he listened and thrust out his blunt jaw farther and farther, and returned no answer. "God, give me the grit to stick it out," begged Haw Haw Langley in an agony of desire. "God, let me see how it comes out. God, let me watch 'em fight. One of 'em's going to die. Maybe two of 'em. Nothing like it has ever been seen." The rain shifted, and the heart of the storm rolled far away. For the moment they could look far out across the shadow-swept hills, and out of the heart of the desolate landscape the whistling ran thrilling upon them. It was so loud and close that of one accord the two listeners jerked their heads about and stared at each other, and then turned their eyes as hastily away, as though terrified by what they had seen, each in the face of the other. It was no idle tune which they heard whistled. It was the rising, soaring paean of delight. It rang down upon the wind. It cut into their faces like drops of the rain. It branded itself like freezing cold into their foreheads. And then, upon the crest of the nearest hill, Haw Haw Langley saw a dim figure through the mist, a man on a horse, and something else running in front, and they came swiftly. "It's the wolf that's running us down," screamed Haw Haw Langley. "Oh, God Almighty, even if we was want to run, the wolf would come and pull us down. Mac, will you save me? Will you keep the wolf away?" He clung to the arm of his companion, but the other brushed him back with a violence which almost unseated Haw Haw. "Keep off'n me," growled Mac Strann, "because when you touch me, it feels like something dead was next to my skin. Keep off'n me." Haw Haw dragged himself back into the saddle with effort, for it was slippery with rain, his face convulsed with something black as hate. "It ain't long you'll do that ordering and be so free with your hands. He's comin' soon, Mac. I'd like to stay. I'd like to see the finish." He stopped, his buzzard eyes glittering against the face of the giant. The rain blotted out the figure of the coming horseman, and at the same instant the whistling leaped close upon them. It was as if the whistling man had disappeared at a place where the rain swallowed his form and had taken body again at their very side. Mac Strann shrank back against the wall, bracing his shoulders, and gripped the butts of his guns. But Haw Haw Langley cast a frightened glance on either side, his head making bird-like pecking motions, and then he leaned over the pommel of his saddle with a wail of despair and spurred off into the rain. End of chapter 39. Chapter 40 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 40. The Arroyo. He disappeared instantly in that shivering curtain of grayness. Mac Strann sat by the ruined house alone. Now, in a time of danger, a child will give courage to the strong man. There is a wonderful communion between any two in time of crises, and when Haw Haw Langley disappeared through the rain, it was to Mac Strann as it was to Patroclus when Apollo struck the base of his neck and his armor of proof fell from him. Not only was there a singular sense of nakedness, but it seemed to him also that the roaring of the rain became a hostile voice of threatening at the same instant. He had never in his life feared any living thing, but now there was a certain hollowness in the region of his stomach, and his heart fluttered like a bird in the air, with appalling lightness, and he wished to be far away. With the clear heaven above him, aye, that would be different, but God had arranged this day, and had set the earth like a stage in readiness for a death, and that was why the rain lashed the earth so fiercely. He looked down. After his death the wind would still continue to beat that muddy water to foam. Aye, in that very place all would be as it was at this moment. He would be gone, but the sky and the senseless earth would remain unchanged. A sudden yearning seized him for the cabin among the mountains, with the singing of the coffee pot over the fire, the good, warm, yellow fire that smoked between the rocks, and the skins he had left leaning against the wall of the cabin to dry. He remembered them all in one glance of memory. Why was he here, then, when he should have been so far away, making his roof snug against this torrent of rain? Now, there would be no rain, surely, in those kindly mountains. Their tall peaks would shut out the storm clouds. Only this plain, these low hills, were the place of hell. He swung the head of his horse to one side, drove deep the spurs, and leaning his head to the volleying of the rain, he raced in a direction opposite to that in which Haw Haw Langley had disappeared, in a direction that led as straight as the line of a flying bird towards that cabin in the mountains. Now and then the forefeet of his great horse smashed into a pool and sent a muddy shower of rain flying up. It crackled against his slicker, it beat like hands against his face. Everything was striving, all the elements of wind and rain, to hold him back. Yet flight brought a blessed sense of relief and of safety. He eased the pace of his horse to a moderate gallop, and no longer driving blindly through the hills, he made out, by peering into the blast of rain, some of the pools which lay in his path, and swung aside to avoid them. The rain lightened again about him. He caught a view of the kindly sheltering hills on all sides. But as he urged his horse on towards them, a shrill flight of whistling fell upon his ears from behind. He drew his horse at once to a halt and listened with his heart knocking at his teeth. It was impossible, manifestly, that the fellow could have followed his track through the rain. For that matter, if the wolf fiend could follow traces over a plain awash with water, why might they not as well follow the tracks of Haw Haw Langley? There was no good reason. The whistling? Well, the whistler was far away in the heart of the storm, and the sound was merely blown against the wind by a chance echo. Yet he remained holding his rein taut, and listening with all his might. It came again, suddenly as before, sharp and keen as a shaft of light in the blackest heart of night, and Mac Strann leaned over the pommel of his saddle with a groan, and drove his spurs home. At the same instant the rain shut in over the hills again. A fresher wind sprang up and drove the downpour into his face. Also its roar shut out the possibility of any sound reaching him from behind. He was the worse for that. As long as the whistling might reach him, he could tell how near the pursuer rode. But in this common roar of the rain, the man might be at any distance behind him, on his very heels indeed. Aye, Dan Barry might rush up upon him from behind. He had seen that black stallion, and he would never forget those graceful, agile lines, that generous breast, wide for infinite wind and the great heart. If the stallion were exerted, it could overtake his own mount as if he were standing still. Not on good footing, perhaps, but in this mucky ground the weight of his horse was terribly against him. He drove the spurs home again. He looked back again and again, piercing the driving mist of rain with starting eyes. He was safe still. The destroyer was not in sight, yet he might be riding close behind that wall of rain. His horse came to a sudden halt, sliding on all 4 feet and driving up a rush of dirty water before him. Even then he had stopped barely in time, for his 4 feet were buried to the knees in water. Before Mac Strann lay a wide arroyo. In ordinary weather it was dry, as all the desert around, but now it had cupped the water from miles around and ran bank full, a roaring torrent. On its surface the rain beat with a continual crashing, like axes falling on brittle glass, and the downpour was now so fearful that Mac Strann, for all his peering, could not look to the other side. He judged the current to see if he might swim his horse across. But even while he stared, the stump of a cottonwood went whirling down the stream, struck a rock, perhaps, on the bottom, flung its entire bulk out of the water with the impact, and then floundered back into the stream again, and whirled instantly out of sight in the sheeted rain. No horse in the world could live through such a current, but the arroyo might turn. He swung his horse and spurred desperately along the bank, keeping his eye upon the bank. No, the stream cut back in a sharp curve and headed him farther and farther in the direction of the pursuer. He brought the mighty horse to another sliding halt and swung about in the opposite direction, for surely there must lie the point of escape. Desperately he rode, for the detour had cost him priceless time, yet it might be made up. Aye, the stream sloped sharply into the direction in which he wished to ride. For distance he could not judge, since seconds were longer than minutes to Mac Strann now. And then the edge of the stream curved back again. He thought it must be a short twist in the line of the arroyo, but following it a little further, he came to realize the truth. The arroyo described a wide curve and a sharp one, and to ride down its banks on either side was merely to throw himself into the arms of Whistling Dan. Once he struck his fleshy forehead, and then turned with gritting teeth and galloped back for the point at which he had first arrived. To his maddened brain it occurred that the current of the arroyo might by this have somewhat abated. He might now make his way across it. So he halted once more on the bank at that point where the stream doubled back on its course, and once more in an agony studied the force of the current. It seemed so placid at the first glance that he was on the verge of spurring the horse into the wide brown stream, but even as he loosened the reins, a gap opened in the middle of the water, widened, whirling at the brim, and drew swiftly into a fierce vortex with a black, deep bottom. Mac Strann tightened his reins again, and then turned his horse and waited. Back the veriest coward against the wall, and he becomes formidable, and Mac Strann was one who had never feared before either man or beast or the powers of the storm. Even now he dreaded no reality, but there dwelt in his mind the memory of how Dan Barry had glared at him in the Gilead saloon, and how a flicker of yellow light had glowed in the man's eyes, a strange and phosphorescent glimmer that might be seen in the darkness of night. When he turned the head of his horse away from the arroyo, he waited as one waits for the coming of a ghost. There was the same chill tingling in his blood. Now the blanket of rain lifted and shook away to comparative clearness. Lifted, and for the first time he could look far away across the plains. Nothing but gray, rain-washed desert met his eyes, and then the whistling broke once more upon him at the crest of a trilling run. Mac Strann strained his eyes through the mist of the storm, and then he saw vaguely, as a phantom, the form of a horseman rushing swiftly into the very teeth of the wind. The whistle wavered, ended, and its place the long yell of a wolf cut the air. Mac Strann brandished a ponderous fist in defiance that was half hysterical. Man or beast alone he would meet, but a wolf man. He whirled the horse again and urged him heedlessly into the water. The whirlpool no longer opened before him. It had passed on down the arroyo and left in its wake a comparative calm, so that when the horse took the water he made good progress for some distance, until Mac Strann could see clearly the farther bank of the stream. In his joy he shouted to his horse and swung himself clear from his saddle to lighten the burden. At the same time they struck a heavier current, and it struck them down like a blow from above until the water closed over their heads. It was only for a moment, however. Then they emerged, the horse with courageously pricking ears and snorting nostrils just above the flood. Mac Strann swung clear, gripping the horn of the saddle with one hand, while with the other he hastily divested himself of all superfluous weight. His slicker went first, ripped away from the throat and the shoulders, and whipped off his body by one tug of the current. Next he fumbled at his belt and tossed this also, guns and all, away, striking out with his legs and his free arm to aid the progress that now forged ahead with noticeable speed. The current, to be sure, was carrying them farther down the stream, but they were now almost to the center of the arroyo, and though the water boiled furiously over the back of the horse, they forged steadily close and closer to the safe shore. It was chance that defeated Mac Strann. It came shooting down the river, and he saw it only an instant too late, a log whipping through the surface of the stream as though impelled by a living force, and with arrowy straightness it lunged at them. Mac Strann heaved himself high. He screamed at the horse as though the poor brute could understand his warning, and then the tree trunk was upon them. Fair and square it struck the head of the horse with a thud audible even through the rushing of the stream. The horse went down like lead, and Mac Strann was dragged down beneath the surface. He came up fighting grimly and hopelessly for life, for he was in the very center of the stream now, and the current swept him relentlessly down. There seemed to be hands in the middle of the arroyo, and when he strove to battle his way to the edge of the water, the current tangled at his legs and pulled him back. Yet even then he did not fear. It was death, he knew, but at least it was a death fighting against the force of nature rather than destruction at the hands of some weird and unhuman agency. His arms began to grow numb. He raised his head to pick out the nearest point on the shore and made his last struggle for life. What he saw was a black head cutting the water just above him, and beside the horse, one hand upon the beast's mane, swam a man. At the same instant a hand fastened on his collar, and he was drawn slowly against the force of the river. In the stunning surprise of the first moment, he could make no effort to save himself, and as a result, all three were washed hopelessly down the current. But a shrill warning from his rescuer set him fighting again with all the power of his great limbs. After that, they forged steadily towards the shore. The black horse swam with amazing strength, and breaking the force of the current for the men, they soon passed from the full grip of the torrent and forged into the smoother shallows at the side of the stream. In a moment firm land was beneath the feet of Mac Strann, and he turned his dull eyes of amazement upon Dan Barry. The latter stood beside the panting black horse. He had not even thrown off his slicker in the fording of the stream. There had been no time for even that small delay if he wished to save Strann. And now he was throwing back the folds of the garment to leave free play for his arms. He panted from the fierce effort of the fording, but his head was high, a singular smile lingered about the corners of his mouth, and in his eyes Mac Strann saw the gleam of yellow, a signal of unfathomable danger. From his holsters Barry drew 2 revolvers. One he retained, the other he tossed towards Mac Strann, and the latter caught it automatically. "Now," said the soft voice of Barry, "we're equally armed. Down, Bart." For the wolf dog was slinking with ominous intent toward the giant. "And there's the dog you shot. If you drop me, you can send your next shot into Bart. If I drop you, the teeth of Bart will be in your throat. Make your own terms. Fight in the way you want, knives, if you like 'em, better than guns, or," and here the yellow flamed terribly in Barry's eyes, "bare hand to hand." The grim truth sank slowly home in the dull mind of Mac Strann. The man had saved him from the water to kill him on dry land. "Barry," he said slowly, "it was your bullet that brung down Jerry, but you've paid me back here. There's nothing left on earth worth fighting for. There's your gun." And he threw the revolver into the mud at Barry's feet and turned on his heel and lumbered off into the rain. There was no voice of answer behind him, except a shrill whine of rage from Black Bart, and then a sharp command, "Down," from the master. As the blanket of rain shut over him, Mac Strann looked back. There stood the strange man with the wolf crouched at his feet, and the teeth of Bart were bared, and the hum of his horrible snarling carried the Strann through the beat of the rain. Mac Strann turned again and plodded slowly through the storm. And Dan Barry? Twice men had stood before him, armed, and twice he had failed to kill. Wonder rose in him, wonder and a great fear. Was he losing the desert? Was the desert losing him? Were the chains of humanity falling about him to drag him down to a tamed and sordid life? A sudden hatred for all men, Mac Strann, Daniels, Kate, and even poor Joe Cumberland, welled hot in the breast of Whistling Dan. The strength of men could not conquer him, but how could their very weakness disarm him? He leaped again on the back of Satan and rode furiously back into the storm. End of chapter 40. Chapter 41 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand. Chapter 41. The Falling of Night. It had been hard to gauge the falling of night on this day, and even the careful eyes of the watchers on the Cumberland ranch could not tell when the grayness of the sky was being darkened by the coming of the evening. All day there had been swift alternations of light and shadow, comparatively speaking, as the clouds grew thick or thin before the wind, but at length, indubitably, the night was there. Little by little the sky was overcast, and even the lines of the falling rain were no longer visible. Before the gloom of the darkness had fully settled over the earth, moreover, there came a change in the wind, and the watchers at the rain-beaten windows of the ranch house saw the clouds roll apart and split into fragments that were driven from the face of the sky, and from the clean washed face of heaven the stars shone bright and serene, and still Dan Barry had not come. After the tumult of that long day, the sudden silence of that windless night had more ill omen in it than thunder and lightning. For there was something watching and waiting in silence. In the living room the three did not speak. Now that the storm was gone, they had allowed the fire to fall away until the hearth showed merely fragmentary dances of flame, and a wide bed of dull red coals growing dimmer from moment to moment. Wung Lu had brought in a lamp, a large lamp with a circular wick that cast a bright white light, but Kate had turned down the wick, and now it made only a brief circle of yellow in one corner of the room. The main illumination came from the fireplace and struck on the faces of Kate and Buck Daniels, while Joe Cumberland on the couch at the end of the room was only plainly visible when there was an extraordinarily high leap of the dying flames. But usually his face was merely a glimmering hint in the darkness, his face and the long hands which were folded upon his breast. Often, when the flames leapt, there was a crackling of the embers and the last of the log, and the two nearer the fire would start and flash a glance, of one accord, towards the prostrate figure on the couch. The silence had lasted so long that when at length the dull voice of Joe Cumberland broke in, there was a ring of a most prophetic solemnity about it. "He ain't come," said the old man. "Dan ain't here." The others exchanged glances, but the eyes of Kate dropped sadly and fastened again upon the hearth. Buck Daniels cleared his throat like an orator. "Nobody but a fool," he said, "would have started out of Elkhead in a storm like this." "Weather makes no difference to Dan," said Joe Cumberland. "But he'd think of his hoss." "Weather makes no difference to Satan," answered the faint oracular voice of Joe Cumberland. "Kate?" "Yes." "Is he coming?" She did not answer. Instead, she got up slowly from her place by the fire and took another chair far away in the gloom, where hardly a glimmer of light reached to her, and there she let her head rest, as if exhausted, against the back of the seat. "He promised," said Buck Daniels, striving desperately to keep his voice cheerful, "and he never busts his promises." "Aye," said the old man, "he promised to be back, but he ain't here." "If he started after the storm," said Buck Daniels. "He didn't start after the storm," announced the oracle. "He was out in it." "What was that?" cried Buck Daniels sharply. "The wind," said Kate, "for it's rising. It will be a cold night tonight." "And he ain't here," said the old man monotonously. "Ain't there things that might hold him up?" asked Buck, with a touch of irritation. "Aye," said the old rancher, "they's things that'll hold him up. They's things that'll turn a wild dog, too, and the taste of blood is one of 'em." The silence fell again. There was an old clock standing against the wall. It was one of those tall wooden frames in which, behind the glass, the heavy polished disc of the pendulum alternated slowly back and forth with a wearisome precision, and with every stroke of the seconds there was a faint metallic clangor in the clock, a falter like that which comes in the voice of a very old man, and the sound of this clock took possession of every silence until it seemed like the voice of a doomsman counting off the seconds. Aye, everyone in the room again and again took up the tale of those seconds and would count them slowly, 50, 51, 52, 53, and on, waiting for the next speech, or for the next popping of the wood upon the hearth, or the next wail of the wind that would break upon the deadly expectancy of that count. And while they counted, each looked straight before him with wide and widening eyes. Into one of these pauses the voice of Buck Daniels broke at length. and it was a cheerless and lonely voice in that large room, in the dull darkness and the duller lights. "Do you remember Shorty Martin, Kate?" "I remember him." He turned in his chair and hitched it a little closer to her, until he could make out her face dimly among the shadows. The flames jumped on the hearth, and he saw a picture that knocked at his heart. "The little bow-legged fellow, I mean." "Yes, I remember him very well." Once more the flames sputtered, and he saw how she looked wistfully before her and above. She had never seemed so lovely to Buck Daniels. She was pale indeed, but there was no ugly pinching of her face, and if there were shadows beneath her eyes, they only served to make her eyes seem marvelously large and bright. She was pallid, and the firelight stained her skin with touches of tropic gold, and cast a halo of the golden hair about her face. She seemed like one of those statues wrought in the glory and the rich days of Athens in ivory and in gold, some goddess who has heard the tidings of the coming fall, the change of the old order, and sits passive in her throne, waiting the doom from which there is no escape. Something of this filtered through to the sad heart of Buck Daniels. He too had no hope, nay, he had not even her small hope, but somehow he was able to pity her and cherish the picture of her in that gloomy place. It seemed to Buck Daniels that he would give 10 years from the best of his life to see her smile as he had once seen her in those old bright days. He went on with his tale. "You would have busted laughing if you'd seen him at the Circle Y bar roundup the way I seen him. Shorty ain't so bad with a rope. He's always talking about what he can do and how he can daub a rope on anything that's got horns. He ain't so bad, but then again he ain't so good either. Especially ain't so good at riding. You know what bold legs he got, Kate." "I remember, Buck." She was looking at him at last, and he talked eagerly to turn that look into a smile. "Well, they was the 3 of us got after one 2-year-old, a bull, and a bad 'un. Shorty was on one side, and me and Cuttle was on the other side. Shorty daubed his rope and made a fair catch, but when his hoss set back the rope busted plumb in two. Now Shorty, he had an idea that he could ease the work of his hoss a whole pile if he laid holt of the rope whenever his hoss set down to flop a cow. So Shorty, he had holt on this rope and was pulling back hard when the rope busted, and Shorty, he spilled backwards out in that saddle like he'd been kicked out. Whilst he's laying there, the bull that had took a header when the rope busted come up on his feet again, and I'll tell a man he was rarin' mad. He seen Shorty lying on the ground, and he took a run for Shorty. Me and Cuttle was laughing so hard we couldn't barely swing our ropes, but I made a throw and managed to get that bull around both horns. So my Betty sits down and braces herself for the tug. In the meantime, little Shorty, he sits up and he lays a hand to his head, and same time he sees that bull come tearing for him. Up he jumps, and just then the bull comes to the end of the line, and wonk, down he goes, head over heels, and hits the sand with a bang that must have jostled his liver some, I'll be saying. Well, Shorty, he sees that bull fly up in the air, and he lets out a yell like the world was coming to an end, and starts running. If he'd run straight back the other way, the bull couldn't have run a step, because I had him fast with my rope. But Shorty seen me, and he comes tearing from my horse to get behind him. The bull was like a cat getting to his feet, and he sights Shorty tearing and lights out after him. There they went, lickety-split. That bull was puffing on the seat of Shorty's trousers and tossing his horns and just missing Shorty by inches. And Shorty had his mouth so wide open hollering that you could have thrown a side of beef down his throat, and his eyes were bugging out. Them bow legs of his was stretching 10 yards at a clip, most like, and the boys say that they could hear him hollering a mile away. But that bull, stretch himself all he couldn't gain an inch on Shorty, and Shorty couldn't gain an inch on the bull, till the bull come to the other end of that 40-foot rope, and then whang, goes up the heels of the bull, and down goes his head, and his heels come over, wonk, and hits Shorty right square on the head. Been an ordinary fella, he wouldn't have lived to talk about it afterwards. Seeing it was Shorty, he just goes up in the air and lands about 10 yards away, rolls over, and hits his feet without once getting off his stride, and then he did start running, and he didn't stop running nor hollering till he got plumb back to the house." Buck Daniels sat back in his chair and guffawed at the memory. In the excitement of the tale he had quite forgotten Kate, but when he remembered her, she sat with her head craned a little to one side, her hand raised for silence, and a smile, indeed, upon her lips, but never a glance for Buck Daniels. He knew at once. "Is it him?" he whispered. "Do you hear him?" "Hush!" commanded two voices, and then he saw that old Joe Cumberland was also listening. "No," said the girl suddenly, "it was only the wind." As if in answer, a far, faint whistling broke upon them. She drew her hand slowly towards her breast, as if indeed she drew the sound in with them. "He's coming!" she cried. "Oh, Dad, listen! Don't you hear?" "I do," answered the rancher, "but what I'm hearing don't warm my blood none. Kate, if you're wise, you'll get up and go to your room, and don't pay no heed to anything you might be hearing tonight." End of chapter 41. Chapter 42 of The Night Horseman. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Night Horseman by Max Brand, Chapter 42. The Journey into Night. There was no doubting the meaning of Joe Cumberland. It grew upon them with amazing swiftness, as if the black stallion were racing upon the house at a swift gallop, and the whistling rose and rang and soared in a wild outburst. Give the eagle the throat of the lark, and after he has struck down his prey in the center of the sky and sent the ragged feathers and the slain body falling down to earth, what would be the song of the eagle rising again and dwindling out of sight in the heart of the sky? What terrible paean would he send whistling down to the dull earth far below? And such was the music that came before the coming of Dan Barry. It did not cease as usual at a distance, but it came closer and closer, and it swelled around them. Buck Daniels had risen from his chair and stolen to a corner of the room where not a solitary shaft of light could possibly reach him, and Kate Cumberland slipped farther into the depths of the big chair, so that in their utter silence, in spite of the whistling that blew in upon them, they could hear the dull ticking of the tall clock, and by a wretched freak of fate the ticking fell exactly in with the soaring rhythm of the whistle, and each had a part in the deadliness of the other. Very near upon them the music ceased abruptly. A footfall swept down the hall. A weight struck the door and cast it wide, and Black Bart glided into the room. He cast not a glance on either side. He turned his head neither to right nor to left, but he held straight on until he came to Kate Cumberland, and there he stood before her. She leaned forward. "Bart," she said softly, and stretched out her hands to him. A deep snarl stopped the gesture, and at the flash of the long fangs she sank into the chair. Old Joe Cumberland, with fearful labor, dragged himself to a sitting position upon the couch, and sitting up in this fashion, the light fell fully upon his white face and his white hair and his white beard, so that he made a ghostly picture. Then an outer door slammed, and a light step, at almost a running pace, speeded down the hall. The door was swung wide again, and Dan was before them. He seemed to bring with him the keen, fresh air of the light, and at the opening of the door the flame in the lamp jumped in its chimney, shook, and fell slowly back to its original dimness. But by that glow of light they saw that the sombrero upon Dan Barry's head was a shapeless mass. His bandana had been torn away, leaving his throat bare. His slicker was a mass of rents, and at the neck had been crumpled and torn in 1,000 places, as though strong teeth had worried it to a rag. Spots of mud were everywhere on his boots, even on his sombrero with its sagging brim, and on one side of his face there was a darker stain.
He had ceased his whistling, indeed, but now he stood at the door and hummed as he gazed about the room. Straight to Kate Cumberland he walked, took her hands and raised her from the chair. He said, and there was a fiber and a ring in his voice that made them catch their breaths, "There's something outside that I'm following tonight. I don't know what it is. It is the taste of the wind and the feel of the air and the smell of the ground, and I've got to be riding. I'm saying goodbye for a bit, Kate." "Dan," she cried, "what's happened? What's on your face?" "The mark of the night," he answered. "I don't know what else. Will you come with me, Kate?" "For how long? Where are you going, Dan?" "I don't know where or how long. All I know is I've got to be going. Come to the window. Take the air on your face. You'll understand." He drew her after him and cast up the window. "Do you feel it in the wind?" he called to her, turning with a transfigured face. "Do you hear it?" She could not speak, but stood with her face lifted, trembling. "Look at me," he commanded, and turned her roughly towards him. There he stood leaning close to her, and the yellow light flickered and waned and burned again in his eyes. He held her hands while he stared. Now he dropped them with an exclamation. "You're blank," he said angrily. "You've seen nothing and heard nothing." He turned on his heel. "Bart," he called, and walked from the room, and they heard the panting of his soft step down the hall and on the porch, and then silence. Black Bart slunk to the door and into the hall, but instantly he was back and peering into the gloom of that silent place like an evil-eyed spectre. A sharp whistle rang from outside, and Black Bart started. Still he glided on until he stood before Kate, then turned and stalked slowly towards the door, looking back after her. She did not move, and with a snarl the wolf dog whirled again and trotted back to her. This time he caught a fold of her skirt in his teeth and pulled on it, and under the pressure she made a step. "Kate," called Joe Cumberland, "are you mad, girl, to dream of going out in a night like this?" "I'm not going," she answered hurriedly. "I'm afraid, and I won't leave you, Dad." She had stopped as she spoke, but Black Bart, snarling terribly, threw his weight back and dragged her a step forward. "Buck!" cried old Joe Cumberland, and he dragged himself up and stood tottering. "Shoot that damned wolf, for God's sake, for my sake!" Still the wolf dog drew the girl in that snarling progress towards the door. "Kate!" cried her father, and the agony in his voice made it young and sent it ringing through the room. "Will you go out to wander between heaven and hell on a night like this?" "I'm not going," she answered. "I won't leave you. But, oh, Dad!" He opened his lips for a fresh appeal, but the chorus of the wild geese swept in upon the wind, blown loud and clear and jangling as distant bells out of tune. And Kate Cumberland buried her face in her hands and stumbled blindly out of the room and down the hall, and then they heard the wild neighing of a horse outside. "Buck," commanded Joe Cumberland, "he's stealing my girl, my Kate. Go out, call up the boys. Tell 'em to stop Dan from saddling a horse for Kate." "Wait and listen," cut in Buck Daniels. "Do you hear that?" On the wet ground outside they heard a patter of galloping hoofs, and then a wild whistling, sweet and keen and high, came ringing back to them. It diminished rapidly with the distance. "He's carrying her off on Satan," groaned Joe Cumberland, staggering as he tried to step forward. "Buck, call out the boys. Even Satan can't beat my hosses when he's carrying double. Call 'em out. If you bring her back—" His voice choked and he stumbled and would have fallen to his knees had not Buck Daniels sprang forward and caught him and carried him back to the couch. "What's happened there ain't no man can stop," said Buck hoarsely. "God's work or the devil's work, I dunno, but I know there ain't no place for a man between Dan and Kate." "Turn up the lights," commanded Joe Cumberland sharply. "Got to see. I got to think. Do you hear?" Buck Daniels ran to the big lamp and turned up the wick. At once a clear light flooded every nook of the big room and showed all its emptiness. "Can't you make the lamp work?" asked the old ranchman angrily. "Ain't there any oil in it? Why, Buck, There ain't enough light for me to see your face hardly. But I'll do without the light, Buck. How far will they go? Kate's a good girl. She won't leave me, lad." "She won't," agreed Buck Daniels. "Just gone with Dan for a bit of a canter." "The devil was come back into his eyes," muttered the old man. "God knows where he's heading for, Buck. I bought him in off the range and made him a part of my house. I took him into my heart, and now he's gone out again and taken everything that I love along with him. Buck, why did he go?" "He'll come back," said the big cowpuncher softly. "It's getting darker and darker," said Joe Cumberland, "and they's a kind of ringing in my ears. Talk louder. I don't hear you none too well." "I said they was coming back," said Buck Daniels. Something like a light showed on the face of Joe Cumberland. "Aye, lad," he said eagerly. "I can hear Dan whistling, coming back, nearer and nearer. Most like he was just playing a joke on me, huh, Buck?" "Most like," said Buck brokenly. "And there, it's ringing at the door of the house. Was that a footstep on the hall?" "It was," said Buck. "They's coming down the hall." But far, far away he heard the whistling of Dan Barry dying among the hills. "You let the lamp go out," said Joe Cumberland, "and now I can't see nothing. Are they in the room?" "They're here," said Buck Daniels, "coming towards you now." "Dan!" cried the old man, shading his eyes and peering anxiously. "No, I can't see a thing. Can you find me, lad?" And Buck Daniels, softening his voice as much as he could, answered, "I can find you." "Then give me your hand." Buck Daniels slipped his own large hand into the cold fingers of the dying cattleman. An expression of surpassing joy lay on the face of Joe Cumberland. "Whistlin' Dan, my Dan," he murmured faintly. "I'm kind of sleepy. But before I go to sleep tonight, I got to tell you that I forgive you for your joke, pretending to take Kate away. There's nothing but sleep worth while, and going to sleep holding your hand, lad." Buck Daniels dropped upon his knees and stared into the wide, dead eyes. Through the open window a sound of whistling blew to him. It was a sweet, faint music, and being so light it seemed like a chorus of singing voices among the mountains, for it was as pure and as sharp as the starlight. Buck Daniels lifted his head to listen, but the sound faded, and the murmur of the night wind came between. End of chapter 42. Recording by Richard Kilmer, Rio Medina, Texas. End of The Night Horseman by Max Brand.